Hi everyone, I know you are watching this content to accompany your sleep. So before we start, I want to know where you are watching from and what time you are watching. Also, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. On June 6, 2000, a quiet residential neighborhood in the city of Fort Worth, Texas, became the backdrop for a shocking and brutal crime that would captivate the community and make national headlines. The victim, 39-year-old Samantha Dean, a mother of two, was found murdered in her own home, a place that should have been her sanctuary. Samantha was well known in her neighborhood. A friendly, outgoing woman, she worked as a secretary at a local law firm and was known for her warm smile and generosity. Neighbors described her as a kind soul, always willing to lend a hand or offer a friendly word. It was hard to imagine that anyone would want to harm her, let alone end her life. The events leading to her tragic death began earlier in the evening, just after dinner. Samantha's ex-husband, 42-year-old Gregory Johnson, had arrived at her home to pick up their two children for his scheduled visitation. The two had been divorced for several years, but the custody arrangement had been amicable. On this particular evening, there was no indication that anything was out of the ordinary. Gregory had been a constant presence in their children's lives, and Samantha had always tried to maintain a sense of civility for their sake. Though the divorce had been difficult, both parties had done their best to co-parent, and Samantha was always careful to avoid conflict when it came to their children. But on this night, something changed. After Gregory arrived to pick up the kids, he and Samantha had a brief conversation in the kitchen. Neighbors would later recall hearing raised voices from inside the house, but nothing seemed alarming at the time. As the evening wore on, a neighbor who had been walking her dog around the block noticed that the lights in Samantha's home remained on much later than usual. Around 11 p.m., the neighbor, who had grown concerned about the unusual quietness of the house, decided to call the police. What she didn't know was that Samantha's lifeless body was already lying in a pool of blood in the kitchen, her death the result of multiple stab wounds. The police arrived at the house just after midnight, responding to the call from the concerned neighbor. They found the front door ajar and no signs of forced entry. Inside, the house was eerily still, but it was immediately apparent that something terrible had occurred. Blood was splattered across the kitchen floor, and Samantha's body was found lying face up in the center of the room, a knife still embedded in her chest. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication of burglary or robbery. The scene suggested that Samantha had known her killer, and the brutal nature of the crime indicated that the attack had been personal. The police quickly began questioning neighbors and anyone who had been in contact with Samantha in the days leading up to her death. The investigation initially pointed to Gregory Johnson, Samantha's ex-husband, as the prime suspect. Gregory had been the last person to see her alive, and the tension between them had been rising in recent weeks. While the couple had maintained a cordial relationship, there had been reports of minor arguments and disagreements, especially regarding their children. Some of Samantha's friends later revealed that she had confided in them about feeling uneasy around Gregory, sensing that something was off in their interactions. Despite these suspicions, the police didn't have enough evidence to arrest Gregory immediately. They continued to investigate, looking for any possible witnesses or additional evidence that could help piece together what had happened. Gregory, for his part, was cooperative with the authorities. He denied any involvement in the murder, insisting that he had left Samantha's house peacefully after picking up the children. The police found no signs of Gregory's DNA at the crime scene, and while his fingerprints were found on a glass in the kitchen, it was clear that the glass had been handled earlier in the evening, before the murder. Without any definitive physical evidence linking Gregory to the crime, the case seemed to stall, and frustration began to mount within the investigation team. It wasn't until a breakthrough came 3 days later that the investigation took a dramatic turn. A neighbor, who had noticed a car parked outside Samantha's house on the night of the murder, came forward with new information. She had observed a man she did not recognize leaving the house around 10:30 p.m. and walking quickly toward a black sedan parked down the street. She had been hesitant to speak up, thinking it was just another person visiting, but after hearing about the murder on the news, she realized that the man she had seen could be connected to the crime. The police, armed with this new lead, began to investigate the mysterious man. They soon discovered that the individual in question was someone with a long history of criminal activity. A man named David Wright, 38, with multiple arrests for assault, drug possession, and theft. David had been known to Samantha through her ex-husband, Gregory, who had introduced him as a friend several months earlier. David's relationship with Gregory had remained somewhat ambiguous, but it was clear that the two had become acquainted. Gregory, it seemed, had been involved in some shady dealings in recent months, though he had always kept this aspect of his life hidden from his ex-wife. It appeared that David may have been more than just a casual acquaintance. The police began to focus their attention on David, convinced that he might hold the key to solving the murder. The next step in the investigation would prove to be pivotal. A search of David Wright's apartment revealed a bloody shirt, which forensic analysis confirmed to be covered in Samantha's blood. The evidence was damning. David was arrested on June 9, 2000, and charged with the murder of Samantha Dean. David Wright's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. The revelation that he was involved in Samantha's murder, especially given his connection to Gregory, only deepened the mystery surrounding the crime. The police, now fully focused on David, worked tirelessly to build a case against him. What remained unclear, however, was David's exact role in the murder. Had he acted alone, or had he been part of a larger plan involving Gregory? David's initial interrogation didn't yield much. He denied any involvement in Samantha's death, insisting that he had only been at her house earlier in the evening to hang out with Gregory. His story was that he had arrived to meet his friend, and was there for only a short time before leaving with Gregory. David's account seemed vague and inconsistent, especially considering the fact that he was seen leaving the house late that night, and the bloody shirt found in his apartment didn't match his story. The police, still uncertain of the true nature of the relationship between Gregory and David, began digging into David's past. They found that David had a lengthy criminal record, filled with violent offenses, including assault and robbery. His history of aggression and disregard for the law painted him as someone who might be capable of such a heinous act. But what was his motive? Why would David kill Samantha? As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that there was a darker side to David's relationship with Gregory. The two men had met a few years earlier while serving time in a Texas prison, and their bond had strengthened after their release. However, their friendship had been marked by secrets and unspoken tensions. Gregory's involvement in petty criminal activities and David's penchant for violence were both concerning, but it wasn't until detectives uncovered a series of heated arguments between Gregory and Samantha in the months leading up to the murder that things started to make sense. Samantha had begun to distance herself from Gregory due to his increasingly erratic behavior. She had voiced her concerns to her close friends, saying that she was afraid he was spiraling back into a dangerous lifestyle. She confided that Gregory had become more volatile and seemed desperate. Her intuition told her that something was wrong, but she was determined to protect their children from the chaos that seemed to be consuming their father. It seemed that David's presence in Gregory's life had become a catalyst for something much darker. Police discovered that Gregory and David had been involved in several schemes that Samantha had not been aware of, including drug trafficking and theft. Gregory had been struggling financially and, in his desperation, had begun to turn to more dangerous people, including David, who had a reputation for being ruthless. The detectives found out that on the night of Samantha's murder, Gregory had planned to confront her about a recent dispute they had regarding the custody arrangements for their children. According to the evidence, Gregory had become increasingly angry when Samantha told him she was planning to take legal action to modify their custody agreement. The argument between the two had escalated quickly. Gregory, unable to control his temper, had called David for help. At some point during the evening, David had become involved in the confrontation, though it wasn't entirely clear what transpired between him and Samantha. It was believed that David had been the one to fatally stab Samantha, likely acting at Gregory's behest, though investigators still weren't sure of the specifics. What was certain was that the killing had been brutal and premeditated. The knife found in Samantha's chest had been a weapon from David's personal collection, and it was clear that she had fought for her life. Her defensive wounds, especially on her arms, suggested that she had tried to ward off the attack before she was overpowered. The next phase of the investigation involved securing testimonies and evidence from those who had witnessed David and Gregory together before the murder. Several individuals who had interacted with the two men in the days leading up to Samantha's death confirmed that Gregory had been on edge, and David had seemed eager to assist him with whatever problem was weighing on Gregory's mind. Some witnesses even described overhearing conversations where Gregory had talked about taking care of the situation, though they hadn't known what he meant at the time. The key breakthrough came when a neighbor of Gregory's came forward with a disturbing piece of information. The neighbor had seen Gregory and David talking in the driveway on the evening of June 6th. According to the witness, The two men appeared to be arguing, and the confrontation became heated. The neighbor had heard Gregory yelling, "I told you she wouldn't listen. You need to make her listen." This statement made it clear that Gregory had intended for Samantha to be silenced in some way, and the discovery of the bloody shirt in David's apartment was the final piece of the puzzle. The forensic evidence tied David directly to the crime, and his refusal to cooperate with authorities only deepened the suspicion surrounding him. On June 12, 2000, David Wright was formally charged with capital murder. Gregory Johnson, who had been arrested earlier in the investigation, was also charged with capital murder, though his role in the killing remained less clear. Authorities believed that Gregory had orchestrated the attack, knowing that his former friend would be willing to carry out the crime for him. Despite his involvement, Gregory had not physically committed the murder, which was why he was charged as an accomplice. The trial was set to begin in the months following their arrests, and the small town of Fort Worth was left reeling from the brutal, senseless crime. As the details of the murder continued to unravel, the community struggled to come to terms with the fact that two men, whose names were once associated with friendship, had turned on Samantha in the most horrific way possible. For Samantha's family and friends, the pain of her loss was compounded by the knowledge that her death had been caused by the very people who were supposed to care for her and their children. In the days following her death, those who knew Samantha continued to speak of her kindness, her generosity, and her love for her children, a stark contrast to the brutal act that ended her life. As the days dragged on, the pain of Samantha's loss was felt deeply in the Fort Worth community. A memorial service was held in her honor, and many of her friends and family gathered to mourn the life that had been so cruelly taken. In the wake of her death, her children were left without their mother, and the damage caused by the crime would last long after the trial. The trial of David Wright and Gregory Johnson began in early 2001, nearly 7 months after the murder. The courtroom was filled with a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, disbelief, as those who knew Samantha were forced to relive the horror of that night. As the prosecution presented their case, the details of the murder were laid bare, each revelation more shocking than the last. David's defense was one of denial. His attorneys argued that he had not intended to kill Samantha, claiming that he had acted in the heat of the moment. They portrayed him as a man who had been manipulated by Gregory into committing the crime, suggesting that Gregory had been the one to truly orchestrate the murder. They attempted to paint David as a victim of circumstance, someone who had been pressured into violence by a man he had once considered a close friend. But the prosecution had a different view. They argued that David had played a central role in the murder, and that he had acted with premeditation. They presented evidence that David had been involved in planning the attack, as well as the fact that he had been the one to actually carry out the stabbing. The forensic evidence, including the blood on his clothes and the knife found in his possession, left little room for doubt. David's actions were deliberate, and the prosecution maintained that he had been a willing participant in the killing. Gregory's defense, on the other hand, was built around the claim that he had not directly participated in the murder. They argued that while Gregory had been present and had possibly urged David to take action, he had not physically carried out the crime himself. His attorneys worked to show that Gregory had been caught in a web of his own poor decisions, that he had been struggling with his finances, his mental state, and his relationship with Samantha. They suggested that he had become desperate and had acted out of frustration, but they denied that he had been the mastermind behind the murder. Despite their efforts, the evidence against Gregory was overwhelming. Witnesses testified about the volatile nature of his relationship with Samantha and the arguments they had over the years. Neighbors spoke of Gregory's increasingly erratic behavior in the days leading up to the murder. Forensic experts confirmed that his fingerprints had been found at the scene, and that his DNA was present on items in the house. It was clear that Gregory had been a key player in the events that had led to Samantha's death, even if he hadn't physically killed her. The trial dragged on for weeks, with both sides presenting their case in an attempt to convince the jury of their client's innocence or guilt. However, there was a growing sense of unease in the courtroom. The jury, made up of members of the same community that had once known and respected Gregory and Samantha, seemed to grow more convinced with each passing day that both men were guilty. Finally, after days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. David Wright was found guilty of capital murder, and the jury recommended the death penalty. They found that David had acted with malice, that his actions had been premeditated, and that the brutality of the murder showed a clear disregard for human life. His sentencing was set for later that year. Gregory Johnson, on the other hand, was convicted of capital murder as well, but his sentence was slightly different. The jury recommended a life sentence without the possibility of parole. They believed that while Gregory had been deeply involved in the crime, he had not physically taken Samantha's life, and his actions had been fueled by desperation and a series of poor choices, rather than pure malice. In the days following the verdicts, the community was left to grapple with the consequences of the crime. For Samantha's family, the pain of losing her was still raw, and the justice system's attempt to hold her killers accountable provided little comfort. Her children, now left to grow up without their mother, were placed in the care of relatives, and the sadness of the situation weighed heavily on everyone who had known Samantha. Though the legal system had done its part to bring her killers to justice, the emotional scars left behind by the crime were far from healed. Those who had loved Samantha struggled to make sense of the senselessness of her death, knowing that she had been taken from them too soon, and in such a brutal manner. As for Gregory and David, their fates were sealed. Gregory, who had once been a father and a man in search of redemption, would now spend the rest of his life behind bars. David, who had once stood by his side, would face the ultimate penalty for his role in the crime. The two men, who had shared a bond of friendship and criminality, had both been consumed by their own darkness, and their actions would forever change the lives of everyone they touched. The murder of Samantha Dean left a scar on the community of Fort Worth that would never fully fade. But as time passed, her memory lived on. Her friends and family honored her life, keeping her spirit alive in the hearts of those who loved her. And though the pain of her loss would never be fully healed, the knowledge that justice had been served, albeit slowly, offered a small measure of peace in a tragedy that would never be forgotten. Story 2. On June 23, 2000, the small town of Rockport, Texas, was rocked by a crime so unexpected that it left the entire community in shock. The victim, 47-year-old Angela Carter, a local high school teacher, was found dead in her home, the result of a brutal and senseless attack. Her death would spark an investigation that would reveal a dark secret within the tight-knit town, one that would haunt its residents for years to come. Angela had lived in Rockport for nearly a decade. She was well liked by her colleagues and students, known for her dedication to her work as an English teacher. Her passion for literature and her ability to connect with students made her a beloved figure in the town's high school. Outside of the classroom, Angela was known for her kind nature, her involvement in local charities, and her love for animals. She had no known enemies, and those who knew her were quick to describe her as a kind-hearted woman who always had a smile on her face. However, despite her outward appearance of having a stable and fulfilling life, Angela had been going through a difficult period in the months leading up to her death. Her marriage to her husband, Charles Carter, had begun to unravel, and the couple had been living in what friends and family described as a strained and emotionally distant relationship. Angela had confided in several friends that she felt increasingly isolated and unhappy in her marriage, but she had always been reluctant to go into specifics. There were whispers that Charles, a successful local businessman, had been unfaithful to her, though Angela never openly discussed it. Charles, who had been married to Angela for nearly 20 years, was a man of few words. He was quiet, reserved, and somewhat reclusive, preferring to stay out of the spotlight. His business, a successful auto repair shop, kept him busy, but there were reports of tension between him and Angela in the weeks leading up to her death. Their arguments, often about money and Charles's growing emotional distance, had become more frequent. Despite this, Angela had not sought a divorce, likely due to her concern for their teenage son, Lucas, who was a senior at Rockport High School at the time. On the night of June 23rd, Angela's neighbors reported seeing her car parked in the driveway around 7:30 p.m. Everything seemed normal. Her lights were on, and her home appeared to be undisturbed. Yet, when a neighbor attempted to call her at around 10 p.m., they received no answer, which was unusual. Concerned, the neighbor walked over to Angela's house and knocked on the door. There was no response. After a few minutes, the neighbor tried again, but this time, the door was slightly ajar. Stepping inside, the neighbor immediately noticed something was wrong. The house was eerily quiet, and the unmistakable scent of something metallic filled the air. The neighbor walked through the house, calling Angela's name, but there was no reply. As they reached the living room, the sight that greeted them was something they would never forget. Angela was lying motionless on the floor, her body covered in blood. A large knife, stained with crimson, was found near her side. The scene was one of unimaginable violence, and it was clear that Angela had been the victim of a vicious, frenzied attack. The police were called to the scene at around 10:30 p.m. By the time they arrived, the house had been secured, and the body had been covered to preserve the crime scene. It was immediately clear that Angela's death was not an accident. She had been deliberately murdered. The knife wounds on her body were numerous, and the excessive nature of the attack suggested that the killer had acted out of rage or deep personal animosity. As the investigation began, the police turned their attention to Angela's husband, Charles. Although there were no signs of forced entry into the home, and nothing appeared to have been stolen, investigators were quick to focus on the one person who had the closest access to Angela, her spouse. Charles had been the last person to see her alive, and the couple's recent struggles made him the primary suspect. At first, Charles was cooperative with the authorities. He claimed that he had been at home working late on June 23rd, attending to some paperwork for his business. According to him, he had not seen Angela that evening, as she had been out running errands earlier in the day. However, when the police dug deeper, they uncovered inconsistencies in his story. Charles had mentioned that he'd been home all night, but his alibi was weak, and neighbors reported not having seen him at the house at all during the evening. His business, which was located only a few blocks from their home, had not been open late, and no one had seen him in the area. Charles's lack of a solid alibi, combined with the violent nature of the crime, made him a suspect. The police also discovered that, in the days leading up to Angela's murder, there had been heated arguments between the couple. Friends and colleagues who had spoken to Angela in the weeks before her death described her as being emotionally distressed, often talking about her fears that her marriage was falling apart. One of Angela's closest friends even revealed that she had recently discovered Charles's infidelity, which may have been the breaking point for their marriage. In addition to the troubling details about the couple's relationship, the police discovered something else that made Charles appear even more suspicious. A search of his car revealed traces of Angela's blood on the passenger seat, and forensic analysis confirmed that the blood was consistent with Angela's type. This discovery was a crucial piece of evidence, as it suggested that Charles had been directly involved in the crime. But the most damning evidence came from a source that no one had anticipated: their son, Lucas. During the investigation, Lucas was questioned by the police. Initially, he seemed devastated by his mother's death and adamant that his father was innocent. However, as the police pressed him further, they learned that Lucas had overheard a violent argument between his parents earlier that evening. Lucas had been in his room, attempting to study for his finals, when he heard raised voices coming from the living room. He couldn't make out all the words, but he distinctly remembered hearing his father say, "If you leave me, I'll make you regret it." At the time, Lucas had thought it was just another one of their usual arguments, but after learning of his mother's death, he realized that something more sinister had taken place. He told the police that after hearing the argument, he had gone downstairs to find his father in a hurry, leaving the house with a strange look on his face. When Lucas tried to speak to him, Charles had simply told him to go back to his room and stay out of it. Lucas's testimony, along with the blood evidence and Charles's inconsistent statements, finally convinced the police that they had their killer. Charles Carter was arrested on June 25, 2000, and charged with the murder of his wife, Angela. The arrest of Charles Carter sent shockwaves through Rockport, a town where secrets were often buried beneath the surface. Though the investigation had cast a dark shadow over him, many of Angela's friends and family still struggled to believe that Charles was capable of such a horrific act. They remembered the couple's early years together, a time when their relationship seemed loving and full of promise. Angela had always spoken of Charles with fondness, often mentioning his quiet nature and his devotion to their family. But as the days passed and the details of the investigation unfolded, it became clearer that the man they once knew was no longer the person they thought he was. Charles's arrest was not an easy one. When the police arrived at his home to take him into custody, he initially appeared calm, almost too calm. His demeanor was cold and detached, but he made no attempt to resist. When questioned about his involvement in Angela's death, Charles repeatedly denied any wrongdoing, maintaining that he had no idea who could have killed her. He insisted that their marriage, while strained, had not reached the point of violence, and that he had no reason to harm her. His alibi, though shaky, remained consistent. He had been working at his auto repair shop that evening, only to return home later to find his wife gone. The police, however, were unconvinced. They had already uncovered enough evidence to challenge his story. The blood found in his car, the traces of Angela's DNA, and the testimony from Lucas all pointed toward Charles as the prime suspect. But what had driven him to kill? What had happened in the hours leading up to Angela's death that pushed him over the edge? The investigation into Charles's past began to reveal a pattern of behavior that had been hidden from view. While he had kept his emotions in check for years, the police discovered that Charles had a history of anger management issues. Friends from his youth recalled incidents where he had lost control, shouting and lashing out at those closest to him. It became evident that Charles had always struggled with his emotions, and that his quiet demeanor had been a facade, hiding a deep well of resentment and frustration. Angela's close friends revealed that, in the months before her death, she had started to distance herself from Charles. They spoke of her growing fears, of her feeling trapped in a marriage that had become more like a prison than a partnership. Her suspicions about Charles's infidelity had been confirmed, but what hurt her the most was his indifference. He had never apologized, never shown remorse for his actions. The lack of empathy from her husband had eroded the love she once felt for him, and she had been preparing to file for divorce. Charles's infidelity had been the catalyst for the unraveling of their relationship. Angela had discovered that her husband had been seeing another woman, someone he had been involved with for nearly a year. The woman, whose name was never made public, was described as a younger woman who had become an obsession for Charles. She was someone who, in his mind, could offer him the escape he so desperately craved. Angela's discovery of the affair had shattered her, but it was not just the infidelity that hurt her. It was the realization that her husband no longer cared about their family. The police uncovered a series of heated arguments between Charles and Angela in the days leading up to the murder. Neighbors had heard shouting matches late into the night, with Charles accusing Angela of being overly controlling and unsympathetic to his needs. Angela, on the other hand, had grown more vocal about her desire for a fresh start, a life free from the shackles of a loveless marriage. The tension had reached a boiling point on the night of June 23rd. As investigators pieced together the events of that night, it became clear that the argument between Charles and Angela had escalated in a way that no one could have predicted. According to Lucas, who had overheard his parents' argument, Charles had become increasingly agitated. The details of the argument were vague, but Lucas recalled hearing his father yelling at his mother, telling her that if she left him, she would regret it. Angela, exhausted from the constant emotional strain of their marriage, had finally told Charles she wanted a divorce. She had even planned to tell him that evening. That revelation, her intention to leave him, was the catalyst for what followed. Charles, unable to handle the idea of losing his wife, flew into a rage. The argument turned violent, and in the heat of the moment, Charles grabbed the nearest object, a kitchen knife, and stabbed Angela repeatedly. The brutality of the attack was staggering. It was clear that Charles had not simply acted in a moment of passion. This was the result of months, if not years, of pent-up anger and frustration. The number of wounds on Angela's body indicated that the attack was frenzied, almost as if Charles had been trying to punish her for rejecting him. After the murder, Charles attempted to cover his tracks. He cleaned up the scene as best as he could, wiping down the knife and attempting to hide any evidence of his involvement. However, in his panic, he had overlooked some key details, such as the bloodstains in his car and the telltale marks on his hands. He had left the scene quickly, not wanting to raise suspicion, but the presence of blood in his car told a different story. His attempt to maintain an alibi, claiming he had been working at his shop, was also easily disproven. His actions following the murder suggested a man trying to preserve his normal life, to appear innocent in the eyes of the community. The police also found that Charles had been receiving strange calls on his cell phone in the hours leading up to the murder. The calls were traced to a local number, and when they tracked down the caller, they discovered that Charles had been in communication with the woman he had been having an affair with. The calls were brief, but the timing was suspicious. Charles had been reaching out to her in the moments before and after the murder, and investigators believed that he had been trying to establish an alibi, or perhaps even seeking comfort from the woman after committing the crime. With the evidence mounting against him, Charles was charged with first-degree murder. His trial began in early 2001, and the details of Angela's death were made public. The case became a sensation, not only because of the brutality of the crime, but also because it revealed the dark side of a seemingly quiet, upstanding man. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Charles had never truly loved his wife. He had never been able to accept her independence or her desire for a better life. The prosecution painted a picture of a man consumed by jealousy and rage, a man who would stop at nothing to control the woman he had once promised to cherish. The defense, however, attempted to argue that Charles had been temporarily insane due to the stress of his failing marriage and the revelation of his affair. They claimed that the heat of the moment had clouded his judgment and that he had not planned to kill Angela. In the end, the jury found Charles guilty of first-degree murder. The sentencing phase of the trial was emotionally charged, as Angela's family members spoke of the pain her death had caused. Charles was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case, though legally concluded, continued to haunt Rockport. The town, once a peaceful place, was forever changed by the brutal murder of Angela Carter and the shocking revelation that her killer was someone she had trusted for years. The aftermath of Angela Carter's murder rippled through the community of Rockport for months, with the emotional toll felt by her family, friends, and students. Angela had been more than just a teacher. She had been a mentor, a confidant, and a source of stability for many in the town. Her loss left a void that could never be filled. For her family, the pain of her brutal death lingered, as did the haunting question of why Charles, the man she had once loved, could commit such an unforgivable act. Her son, Lucas, who had witnessed the slow unraveling of his parents' marriage, found himself in a difficult position. The revelation that his father had been responsible for his mother's death shook him to his core. The night of the murder, when he had overheard the heated argument between his parents, replayed in his mind over and over. The words his father had shouted, "If you leave me, I'll make you regret it," haunted him, as he had never imagined that those words would lead to the loss of his mother. Lucas, who had been preparing for graduation at the time, found himself facing the daunting task of continuing his life without the woman who had been his rock. His grief was compounded by the fact that his father, the man he had grown up with, was the very person responsible for the tragedy that had shattered their family. Lucas eventually moved in with his aunt and uncle in a neighboring town, seeking a new life away from the painful memories. But even in his new home, Angela's absence was felt every day. Charles, in the cold confines of his prison cell, was left to face the consequences of his actions. The court had sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, but for Charles, the punishment seemed almost secondary. The real sentence was the torment of knowing that he had taken away the one person who had meant everything to him. His own actions had destroyed his family, and the weight of that realization settled heavily on him in the years that followed. The trial had been a spectacle, one that drew attention from media outlets and captivated the town. Many of the residents of Rockport, who had once seen Charles as a respectable businessman and husband, could barely come to terms with the fact that he was the same person responsible for the murder of his wife. The quiet man who had always kept to himself, who had seemed so ordinary, had turned out to be capable of extraordinary violence. During his time in prison, Charles would occasionally send letters to family members, expressing remorse for his actions. He wrote to his son, begging for forgiveness, but Lucas never responded. The emotional damage that Charles had caused was beyond repair. No amount of regret could undo the pain of losing a mother in such a brutal and senseless way. For those who had loved Angela, there was no closure, only a lingering grief that would never fully fade. In the years following the trial, the memory of Angela Carter remained alive in the hearts of the people who had known her. Her legacy as a compassionate teacher and a dedicated mother lived on through the stories her students shared and the acts of kindness her friends continued to honor. Angela had always been someone who gave to others, and in her memory, several scholarships were established in her name for students pursuing careers in education. Her community, still mourning her loss, tried to focus on the positive impact she had made during her time on Earth. Rockport, once a peaceful town where the quiet hum of daily life had been interrupted only by the occasional storm of festival, was now forever marked by the tragedy of June 23, 2000. The house where Angela had lived, the scene of her brutal murder, became a place of quiet reflection for those who still couldn't fully grasp the depth of the horror that had unfolded within its walls. Some neighbors moved away, unable to continue living in a place so tied to the tragedy. Others remained, but they too carried the weight of the memory of that dark night. As for Charles, he continued to serve his life sentence, a man broken by his own actions. Prison was a harsh and unforgiving place, but for Charles, it was nothing compared to the inner torment he faced each day. His life, once filled with the potential for redemption and reconciliation, had been shattered in an instant. And in the quiet solitude of his cell, with only his thoughts to keep him company, Charles came to understand the magnitude of what he had done. He had lost everything: his wife, his family, his freedom, and most painfully, he had lost the love of his son, the very person who could have saved him from the darkness that had consumed him. For Lucas, the years ahead would be a long journey of healing. He never fully reconciled with his father, but he learned to move forward, to honor his mother's memory in his own way. He graduated from college, became a teacher, and dedicated his life to helping young people the way his mother had. Though the pain of losing Angela never fully faded, Lucas found a sense of purpose in carrying on her legacy, ensuring that her influence continued to shape the lives of others. As the years went by, the town of Rockport slowly began to heal. The tragedy of Angela Carter's murder remained a scar on its history, but the people of Rockport learned to live with the memory. They found solace in the positive changes that had come from the darkness: scholarships in Angela's name, the charitable work she had been involved in, and the countless students whose lives she had touched. Charles Carter, however, would always be remembered as the man who threw it all away, the man who chose violence over love, who allowed jealousy and anger to destroy his life and the lives of those closest to him. His story, a cautionary tale of betrayal and rage, would serve as a grim reminder to the town of the fragility of human relationships and the devastating consequences of losing control. Story 3. In June 2000, a chilling crime took place in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Maplewood, Illinois, a small town known for its peaceful streets and family-friendly atmosphere. The case of the disappearance and eventual murder of 38-year-old Kathleen Wilson shook the community to its core, and would become one of the most unsettling and complex investigations the local authorities had ever undertaken. Katie Wilson was a well-known figure in Maplewood, known for her warm smile, her friendly demeanor, and her work as a nurse at the local hospital. She was a devoted mother to 2 young children, ages 8 and 6, and had been married to her high school sweetheart, 40-year-old Mark Wilson, for nearly a decade. From the outside, the Wilson family appeared to be the picture of suburban bliss. They owned a home in a quiet cul-de-sac, had close friends and neighbors, and led a life that many envied. But beneath the surface, their marriage was far from perfect. Katie had confided in her friends and co-workers that her relationship with Mark had been strained for some time. She spoke of the emotional distance between them, of the fights they had over money, and of the growing resentment she felt toward her husband. Mark, on the other hand, had a history of being controlling and possessive. Those close to Katie noted that, over the years, he had become increasingly withdrawn and less communicative. Some of her friends even suspected that he might have been cheating on her, though Katie never confirmed these suspicions. She had always been reluctant to discuss her personal life in detail, but it was clear to those who knew her that she was unhappy. On the evening of June 18, 2000, Katie returned home from her shift at the hospital around 10 p.m. Her children were already asleep, and Mark was nowhere to be found. This was not unusual, as Mark often worked late hours at his job as a sales manager for a local car dealership. Katie had settled into her usual routine, preparing a light snack and watching TV. It was a quiet night, one that she would never have imagined would end in tragedy. Around midnight, a neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, who had lived next door to the Wilsons for several years, noticed something odd. She had just returned from a late evening walk and saw that the lights in the Wilsons' house were still on. However, when she looked more closely, she saw that the front door was slightly ajar. Mrs. Thompson assumed that Katie had forgotten to lock it after bringing in groceries or after an evening out, but something about it didn't sit right with her. Katie had always been diligent about locking up before bed. Mrs. Thompson knocked on the door, but there was no response. Growing more concerned, she went around to the back of the house and peered through the kitchen window. What she saw sent a chill down her spine. Katie's purse was lying on the kitchen table. Her shoes were still by the front door, and the faint sound of the TV playing could be heard from inside. But there was no sign of Katie. Mrs. Thompson immediately called the police. Within minutes, officers arrived at the scene and began to search the house. The front door was unlocked, but there was no sign of forced entry. The house appeared to be undisturbed, with nothing out of place. But Katie was gone. Her car was parked in the driveway, her personal belongings were still in the house, and there were no signs of a struggle. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. The police began their investigation, starting with the obvious suspect, Mark Wilson. However, when they contacted him, they learned that Mark was out of town for a sales meeting in a neighboring city. His alibi seemed solid. He had checked into his hotel at 9 p.m. that evening and had stayed there until the morning. He was visibly shaken when informed of his wife's disappearance, but his reaction seemed genuine. He immediately agreed to return to Maplewood to assist in the search for his wife. As the search for Katie intensified, the police canvassed the neighborhood and spoke with neighbors, friends, and co-workers. No one had seen or heard anything unusual. The only clue that had surfaced came from a co-worker of Katie's, a woman named Sarah who had worked alongside her in the emergency room. Sarah mentioned that Katie had recently become concerned about Mark's behavior. She had confided that he had been acting increasingly paranoid and had begun monitoring her phone calls and text messages. Katie had even mentioned that she felt like she was being watched. Sarah also revealed that Katie had been contemplating divorce, though she had not yet made any firm decisions. As the days passed and there were no signs of Katie, the police began to focus their attention on Mark. While his alibi had initially seemed solid, investigators started to question whether it was possible that he had staged his absence or manipulated the timeline to make it appear as though he had been out of town when the crime occurred. They also discovered that, in the weeks leading up to Katie's disappearance, Mark had been withdrawing large sums of money from their joint bank account. When questioned about this, Mark claimed that the withdrawals were for an emergency business investment, but the amounts seemed excessive. In addition to the financial discrepancies, Mark's behavior during the investigation became increasingly suspicious. He refused to cooperate fully with the police, insisting that he had nothing to do with his wife's disappearance, yet he also seemed oddly detached from the search efforts. He rarely spoke with the detectives or the search teams, instead choosing to stay in the background, almost as if he were waiting for the situation to blow over. The police continued their search for Katie for several more days, but as time passed, they found no trace of her. Her family and friends held out hope, but deep down, they knew the odds of finding her alive were slim. On June 24th, 6 days after her disappearance, the police received a tip that led them to a remote wooded area on the outskirts of Maplewood. The tip came from a local teenager who claimed to have seen a car matching Katie's parked near a secluded trail. When the police arrived at the location, they began to search the area, combing through the dense trees and brush. It didn't take long before they discovered something. Hidden under a pile of leaves and branches, they found Katie's lifeless body. Katie had been strangled with a piece of her own clothing, and there were signs that she had been dragged into the woods. The location was eerily close to the area where Mark had been known to drive for business trips, but no one had previously thought to search this particular spot. The discovery of Katie's body confirmed everyone's worst fears. She had not run away, and she had not been kidnapped. She had been murdered. The discovery of Katie Wilson's body sent shockwaves through the community. What had started as a routine missing persons case quickly spiraled into a homicide investigation, and all eyes turned to Mark Wilson. The police had already noted several inconsistencies in his story, and now, with Katie's body found just a short distance from where he had claimed to be during her disappearance, the investigation shifted into high gear. Mark was immediately brought in for questioning. When Mark was first interviewed by the police, he seemed distraught and confused, but his emotions were more subdued than expected. His answers to their questions were vague, and he repeatedly insisted that he had no idea who could have done such a thing to his wife. At first, the police were hesitant to make any direct accusations, as they had no concrete evidence linking him to the crime. However, as the hours passed and the questioning grew more intense, cracks began to appear in Mark's story. The timeline of Mark's alibi was the first major issue. Although he had claimed that he was in a neighboring city on the night of June 18th for a sales meeting, further investigation revealed that his hotel check-in time was later than he had originally stated. There was also a gap in his movements during the evening that raised more questions. A local gas station attendant recalled seeing a car matching the description of Mark's vehicle near Maplewood on the night of the murder, but Mark had denied being in town. This contradiction in his statements was troubling, and it suggested that Mark might have been lying. Despite the circumstantial evidence against him, Mark maintained his innocence. He insisted that his marriage, while strained, had not reached the point of violence. He told detectives that he and Katie had argued in the past, but they had always worked through their issues. He even went so far as to say that they had been in a good place before her disappearance, and that there had been no indication that she was planning to leave him or divorce him. The police, however, had a different perspective. They had uncovered significant evidence that suggested Mark's relationship with Katie had been far more troubled than he let on. Interviews with her friends and co-workers painted a picture of a woman who had been increasingly unhappy in her marriage. Katie had expressed fears about Mark's behavior, how he had become controlling and jealous over time. There were reports of him showing up unannounced at her workplace, checking her phone and email messages, and even following her on errands. One co-worker, a close friend of Katie's named Sarah, had overheard Katie talking about Mark's violent temper in the weeks before her disappearance. She had mentioned that she felt trapped and was seriously considering divorce, but she had been unsure of how to break the news to him. Then there was the financial angle. The police found that, in the days leading up to Katie's disappearance, Mark had been making large and suspicious withdrawals from the couple's joint bank account. The amounts were inconsistent with their usual spending habits, and the nature of the withdrawals suggested that Mark might have been preparing for something drastic. When confronted with this information, Mark became defensive, claiming that the money was for an investment opportunity. But the police weren't convinced, especially when they discovered that Mark had failed to inform Katie about the withdrawals or any business ventures he might have been involved in. As the investigation progressed, detectives turned to forensic evidence. The medical examiner confirmed that Katie had died from strangulation, a violent and personal way to take someone's life. The fact that the killer had used a piece of Katie's own clothing, her blouse, as the weapon suggested that the crime was driven by anger and intimacy. The killer had been in close proximity to the victim, and the violence had been committed with deliberate force. In addition, forensic experts discovered that the clothing had been tied around her neck with such force that it left clear marks of compression, further indicating the level of rage involved. The police also found traces of Mark's DNA under Katie's fingernails, evidence that suggested a struggle between the two. It was clear that Katie had fought for her life in her final moments, but she had been overpowered. The fact that her body had been dumped in the woods, hidden under leaves and branches, pointed to an attempt to conceal the crime. Mark, who had been described as a man with a controlling and domineering personality, had likely thought he could get away with it. But the evidence was mounting, and it was becoming increasingly difficult for him to maintain his innocence. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was a series of phone records. The police had discovered that Mark had been in constant communication with a woman named Lisa Crawford, someone he had met through work. The phone records showed that Mark had been calling her several times a day in the days leading up to Katie's murder. On the night of June 18th, just hours before Katie was last seen alive, Mark had made a phone call to Lisa that lasted over 20 minutes. Investigators found that, during the call, Mark had sounded calm and composed, almost as if he were preparing for something. Lisa, when questioned, admitted that Mark had confided in her about his marital problems, and she said that he had often talked about wanting to get out of the situation with Katie. Lisa denied knowing anything about the murder, but the timing of the call and the nature of the conversation raised alarm bells for the investigators. As the days went by, Mark's behavior continued to grow more suspicious. He had originally cooperated with the police, but as the evidence mounted against him, he began to withdraw, becoming more guarded and defensive. He no longer answered their calls promptly and refused to participate in further interviews. The police, now certain that Mark had been involved in Katie's death, finally arrested him on June 27, 2000, just 9 days after her body was discovered. The arrest of Mark Wilson sent shockwaves through the town of Maplewood. Many of the neighbors who had once seen him as a friendly, successful family man were now grappling with the harsh reality that he had been hiding a dark secret. The community had been shaken by the brutal nature of Katie's murder, and it left a lasting impact on everyone who knew her. As the case moved forward, the evidence continued to point to Mark as the sole suspect. He was charged with first-degree murder and held without bond as he awaited trial. Despite his attempts to maintain his innocence, the overwhelming evidence against him made it clear that he was responsible for the death of his wife. The case became a national sensation, drawing attention from the media and the public. The trial of Mark Wilson was highly publicized, and many people were shocked by the details that emerged during the proceedings. It was revealed that Mark had been living a double life, hiding his infidelity and controlling behavior behind the facade of a perfect family. His inability to accept his wife's desire for independence and her plans for a divorce had led him down a dark and irreversible path. The trial would ultimately conclude with a guilty verdict, and Mark was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of his wife, Katie Wilson. As Mark Wilson's trial began, the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. The prosecution had a strong case against him, backed by irrefutable evidence, and they wasted no time in laying out the sequence of events that led to the brutal murder of Katie Wilson. The details of the case were meticulously pieced together, and the court was presented with a clear picture of a man consumed by anger, jealousy, and a desire for control. The prosecution's first witness was the lead investigator in the case, Detective Laura Simpson. She walked the jury through the timeline of events, starting with Katie's disappearance and ending with the discovery of her body. Detective Simpson highlighted the inconsistencies in Mark's alibi, explaining how the phone records, the gas station sighting, and the financial withdrawals painted a clear picture of a man who had something to hide. She also detailed the forensic evidence, including the DNA found under Katie's fingernails, the strangulation marks on her neck, and the traces of Mark's blood found on Katie's clothing. The detective's testimony was methodical and thorough, and it left no room for doubt about Mark's involvement in his wife's death. The prosecution then called Sarah, Katie's close co-worker and friend, to the stand. Sarah's testimony was emotional as she described the relationship between Katie and Mark. Sarah revealed the extent of Katie's fears, recounting the numerous times Katie had confided in her about Mark's controlling behavior. Katie had often expressed concern that Mark's jealousy and possessiveness were escalating, and she had mentioned, on more than one occasion, that she felt like she was walking on eggshells in her own home. Sarah told the jury about the tension she had witnessed between Katie and Mark, particularly in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Katie had been on the verge of leaving him, but she was fearful of what might happen if she did. Sarah's testimony was heart-wrenching, and it painted a vivid picture of a woman trapped in a toxic marriage, desperately seeking a way out. The prosecution also introduced the phone records, which showed the series of calls between Mark and his mistress, Lisa Crawford. They argued that these calls, especially the one on the night of Katie's murder, were indicative of Mark's growing anxiety and need for reassurance. Lisa testified that, during their conversations, Mark had repeatedly mentioned how he felt like Katie was pulling away from him, and that he was struggling to maintain control over her. She also revealed that Mark had often spoken about how he couldn't bear the thought of losing her, and how he was becoming increasingly desperate to keep his family intact. While Lisa denied any involvement in the murder, her testimony painted a picture of a man who was willing to do anything to preserve his own sense of power and control, even at the expense of his wife's life. The most compelling evidence against Mark came from the forensic analysis of the crime scene. The medical examiner testified that the manner of Katie's death, strangulation with a piece of her own clothing, was consistent with a personal attack fueled by anger. The fact that her body had been discarded in the woods, hidden under branches and leaves, suggested an attempt to cover up the crime, further implicating Mark. The examiner also noted that the bruising on Katie's body indicated that she had put up a fight, suggesting that she had tried to defend herself against her attacker. This piece of evidence was crucial in painting a picture of Mark as a man who, in a fit of rage, had taken his wife's life in a violent and desperate act. As the prosecution rested its case, the defense took its turn. Mark's defense attorney, Robert Harris, attempted to cast doubt on the evidence presented by the prosecution. He argued that the phone records could have been misinterpreted and that the gas station sighting was inconclusive. He suggested that there could have been another person responsible for Katie's death, someone who had used Mark's absence as an opportunity to commit the crime. Harris also tried to downplay the significance of the DNA found under Katie's fingernails, suggesting that it could have been transferred during a routine interaction. However, his arguments fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence against Mark. The defense also tried to paint Mark as a grieving husband, who was simply coping with the loss of his wife and the stress of the investigation. But the jury wasn't convinced. The evidence spoke for itself. Throughout the trial, Mark remained largely composed, though he occasionally showed signs of emotion. His demeanor seemed at odds with the gravity of the situation. Some observers noted that he appeared almost detached, as though he were watching the proceedings from a distance rather than living through them. At times, he would glance at the jury with a look of disbelief, as if he couldn't understand why the evidence pointed so clearly in his direction. But even his most stoic moments couldn't mask the growing unease in the courtroom. As the trial continued, it became clear that Mark's defense was unraveling. The more the prosecution presented, the more difficult it became for Mark to deny his guilt. On the final day of the trial, the prosecution delivered their closing argument. The lead prosecutor, Michael Thompson, spoke with conviction as he reminded the jury of the evidence they had seen over the past few weeks. He emphasized the brutality of Katie's murder, the signs of her struggle, and the overwhelming evidence that pointed directly to Mark. Thompson spoke of the life that Katie had lost, the future she would never have with her children, and the betrayal she had suffered at the hands of the man who was supposed to love and protect her. He urged the jury to remember the facts, not the defense's attempts to muddy the waters, and to find Mark guilty of first-degree murder. When the defense made their closing argument, they focused on the idea that there was still reasonable doubt. Harris urged the jury to question the police's conclusions, to scrutinize the evidence, and to consider the possibility of an alternate suspect. But the jury was unmoved. The weight of the evidence was undeniable, and it was clear that Mark Wilson had been the one to take his wife's life. After several days of deliberation, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom was filled with a mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and disbelief. Katie's family, who had been in the courtroom every day, broke down in tears, knowing that justice had been served, but also realizing that their loved one would never come back. Mark's face was unreadable as the verdict was read, but it was clear that the man who had once appeared so composed was now facing the consequences of his actions. Mark Wilson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge's words were stern and unwavering as he spoke of the impact of Mark's crime on his family, the community, and the memory of his wife. Mark's life, as he knew it, was over. He would never again walk free, never again see the life he had tried to preserve through violence and control. The case of Katie Wilson's murder left a deep scar on the community of Maplewood. The shock of her death, the revelation of Mark's true nature, and the painful process of seeking justice would stay with the people of the town for years to come. The Wilson children, left without both parents, would grow up with the memory of the mother they lost and the father who had taken her from them. They would never fully understand the complexity of the tragedy, but they would carry the weight of it for the rest of their lives. Katie's memory lived on in the hearts of those who had known and loved her. Her co-workers, friends, and family members honored her legacy by supporting causes that mattered to her, especially those related to healthcare and children's welfare. In the years following the trial, a scholarship fund was established in Katie's name, aimed at helping young women pursuing careers in nursing. Her legacy, though tragically cut short, lived on in the lives she had touched and the lives she had saved. Mark Wilson, behind bars, would spend the rest of his days facing the consequences of his actions. His trial and conviction had revealed the truth that many had suspected, that beneath the surface of his suburban life lay a man capable of unimaginable violence. And now, he would have to live with the knowledge that his own choices had destroyed everything he had once held dear. Story 4. In the summer of 2000, a quiet town in the Pacific Northwest was shaken by the sudden disappearance of a local woman, Emily Clark. Emily, 29, had been working as a freelance graphic designer for the past several years, and although her lifestyle was independent and relatively solitary, she was well liked by her neighbors and had a close-knit group of friends. Emily had lived in the small town for most of her life, and her sudden absence raised alarm bells in the community. Her disappearance, however, wouldn't be a simple missing persons case. It would become a chilling reminder of how dark the human mind could become when driven by obsession and anger. The last time Emily had been seen was on the evening of July 15, 2000. She had been at a local cafe, where she often met her friend Sarah for coffee and to catch up. The two had been close for years, and it was during this meeting that Emily had confided in Sarah about a new man in her life. His name was David Foster, a recent arrival to the town, who had moved there under mysterious circumstances. Emily had seemed excited about him, speaking of the budding relationship with a hopeful tone, but Sarah noted that there was something different about the way Emily talked about David. She seemed a bit anxious, almost as if she weren't entirely sure about him. Nevertheless, Sarah hadn't thought much of it at the time. It was the next morning when Emily was supposed to meet a client for a project, but she didn't show up. This was out of character for her, as Emily was a punctual and professional individual. Her phone had gone unanswered, and by midday, her friends began to worry. They started calling her family, checking in with her colleagues, and eventually contacted the local authorities to report her as missing. The police took the case seriously, as it was unusual for someone like Emily to simply disappear without a trace. The first few days of the investigation were relatively quiet. There were no signs of a struggle at her apartment, and no one had witnessed anything suspicious. The police combed through Emily's social media, spoke to her family, and interviewed her friends, but none of the information they gathered seemed to provide any clear leads. The only piece of information that stood out was the brief mention of David Foster during Emily's conversation with Sarah the night before. David had only recently moved to town, and few people knew much about him. The more the investigators looked into him, the more questions arose. David Foster was in his mid-30s, tall with dark hair and a well-groomed appearance. He had rented a small cottage on the outskirts of town, and his background was a bit of a mystery. He had no family in the area, and his previous employers in other states could only provide vague references. Some said he had a reputation for being a charming and attractive man, while others described him as somewhat reclusive, often avoiding social events. His interactions with the people of the town had been limited, but he had been seen with Emily on several occasions. There was something about their relationship that intrigued the investigators, particularly because David had been notably absent when the police went to his cottage to ask questions. When they finally tracked him down a few days later, David claimed to have been out of town during Emily's disappearance. He said he had gone to visit a friend in a nearby city, but his alibi seemed flimsy. There were no records of him checking into a hotel, and when the police looked into the details of his story, they found no evidence to support his claims. The officers were suspicious, but without concrete evidence, they had no choice but to let David go, though he was now considered a person of interest. Meanwhile, the search for Emily intensified. A team of volunteers, along with local law enforcement, scoured the surrounding woods and rural areas where Emily had often gone for walks. They searched through the nearby parks and even checked the small lake just outside of town, where Emily had been known to go for a swim on hot days. They found no sign of her, and as days turned into weeks, the sense of dread began to mount. What had happened to Emily Clark? The turning point in the case came when one of Emily's close friends, Lisa Matthews, revealed something alarming during a police interview. Lisa had recently gone through some old emails from Emily's account, and she had stumbled upon a disturbing series of messages exchanged between Emily and David in the weeks before her disappearance. The emails painted a picture of a rapidly deteriorating relationship, one that had gone from seemingly perfect to toxic and controlling. David had begun making demands of Emily, insisting that she spend more time with him and questioning her commitment to their relationship. Emily had expressed growing discomfort with his behavior and had even mentioned that she felt as if she were losing control of the situation. In her final email, Emily had said she needed some space, but she feared how David would react to that. Lisa didn't know what to make of the situation at the time, but upon reviewing the emails, it became painfully clear that David had been pressuring Emily in ways that were far from healthy. The police now had the breakthrough they needed. David's behavior, his unsubstantiated alibi, and the increasingly disturbing pattern of emails pointed to a possible motive: obsession. As the investigation deepened, the police discovered that David had been monitoring Emily's movements more closely than they had realized. He had been showing up at places where she regularly frequented, even when she hadn't invited him. He had also installed a tracking device on her car, unbeknownst to her, in an effort to keep tabs on her every move. With this new information, the police obtained a search warrant for David's cottage. They arrived at the property and, after a thorough search, found a disturbing array of evidence. In his bedroom, hidden beneath the floorboards, was a collection of items belonging to Emily. Photos of her taken without her knowledge, personal belongings she had left behind, and most chillingly, a handwritten journal in which David confessed to his obsession with her. He had detailed every interaction they had, every moment he had spent with her, and the intense frustration he had felt when she began pulling away. In the journal, he wrote about his desire to make Emily his forever, regardless of what that might take. The discovery of this journal was the final piece of the puzzle. David Foster had become consumed by his infatuation with Emily, and when she had tried to distance herself, he had reacted with violent anger. The police pieced together a timeline of events. On the night of Emily's disappearance, David had shown up at her apartment unannounced. They had argued, and in a fit of rage, he had attacked her. The evidence suggested that Emily had fought back fiercely, but in the end, David overpowered her. He then took her body to a remote location outside of town, where he discarded it in a secluded area by a river. The police later recovered her body, partially hidden under branches, just a few miles from David's cottage. David Foster was arrested on July 30th, 2000, just 2 weeks after Emily's disappearance. He was charged with first-degree murder, and the town was left in shock as the full extent of his obsession with Emily came to light. His trial, which would take place later that year, would bring more details to the surface, and the town of Evergreen would never be the same again. As the days passed following David Foster's arrest, the town of Evergreen was in a state of disbelief. Many of the townspeople had grown to know David, or at least had seen him around, and the idea that he was capable of such a crime was unfathomable. His charm and polite demeanor had made him seem harmless, even likable, to those who had interacted with him. It was hard to reconcile that image with the person who had been hiding such dark, obsessive tendencies beneath the surface. The news of Emily Clark's tragic end spread quickly, and with it came a renewed sense of fear. People began to reflect on the relationships around them, questioning if anyone they knew might be hiding similar secrets. As the town grappled with the horror of Emily's murder, her family and friends were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Emily's parents, who had been notified of their daughter's disappearance days after she went missing, were now mourning the loss of their only child. They could hardly believe that their daughter, who had always been independent and full of life, had met such a brutal end at the hands of someone she had trusted. Emily's friends were struggling to understand why David, a man they had barely known, had been able to slip through the cracks of their vigilance. The investigation into David's background deepened as the authorities sought to understand what had driven him to commit such a crime. The more they uncovered, the more chilling his obsession appeared to be. David's life, it seemed, had been a series of relationships marked by emotional control and manipulation. His ex-girlfriends, who were contacted by the police, painted a picture of a man who had been difficult to escape from. They described how David would often shower them with affection and attention early on, only to become possessive and controlling as the relationship progressed. One woman recounted how, in the final months of their relationship, David had become increasingly paranoid, accusing her of cheating and tracking her every move. Another woman recalled how David had once shown up uninvited to her apartment, demanding to know where she had been and who she had been with. It was clear that David had a pattern. His relationships had all ended badly, and each one left a trail of emotional scars. But what made his relationship with Emily so different? Why had he taken things to such an extreme? The answer, investigators would later conclude, lay in the way David saw himself. He viewed relationships not as partnerships between two people, but as possessions to be controlled. Emily's independent nature, her career, and her ability to create her own life outside of their relationship were things that David could not accept. To him, her desire for freedom had become a challenge to his authority, a threat to the control he thought he was entitled to. David's interactions with Emily had started innocently enough, but the more they got to know each other, the more David's insecurities and fears began to surface. His jealousy grew stronger, and his attempts to dominate Emily's life escalated. Emily, for her part, had been initially attracted to David's charisma, his confidence, and the attention he lavished on her. But as time went on, she started to notice the red flags. She began to feel smothered by his constant need for reassurance and control. Emily had tried to break up with him several times, but David wouldn't accept it. Each time she tried to distance herself, he became more persistent. He promised to change, to be the man she needed him to be, but Emily could see through the facade. She knew that David's obsession with her was far from healthy, and she realized that it wasn't love. It was an unhealthy fixation that threatened to consume her. The final straw came when Emily told David that she needed space to think things over, that she needed to focus on herself and her career. It was a request that should have been simple and respectful, but to David, it was an affront. He couldn't comprehend why Emily would want to break free from him, and he became enraged. The emails she had sent to Lisa, revealing her fear of how David would react, were a testament to her growing sense of danger. Emily had felt trapped in a relationship that she could no longer control, and she feared that if she didn't end things with David immediately, she might never get the chance to. But tragically, she would never have that chance. On the evening of July 15th, Emily had agreed to meet David one last time to discuss their relationship. It was supposed to be a calm conversation where they would each say their piece and, hopefully, go their separate ways. But David had other plans. Instead of an amicable breakup, he arrived at Emily's apartment consumed by rage. His love for her had morphed into an obsession that left no room for reason. When Emily tried to tell him that it was over, David snapped. He grabbed her in a fit of anger, and in the chaos of the struggle, he strangled her. It wasn't a crime of passion or a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was the culmination of weeks of escalating jealousy and manipulation. David had decided that if he couldn't have Emily, no one else would. The fact that David had gone to such lengths to cover up his crime only made it more evident that he knew exactly what he had done. He didn't just kill Emily and walk away. He went to great lengths to hide her body, as though he were trying to erase the evidence of his crime. He knew that if he was caught, his life as he knew it would be over. And so he tried to keep up the appearance of normalcy, pretending that everything was fine, that Emily had simply disappeared on her own. David's arrest was a turning point, not just for the investigation, but for the town itself. The shock of the crime had shaken Evergreen to its core, and now, as the truth began to come to light, the community was forced to confront the fact that such violence could happen even in the most idyllic of places. Emily Clark, the vibrant, talented woman who had been taken too soon, became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked obsession and control in relationships. As the trial approached, the town prepared for the uncomfortable reality of having to revisit the details of Emily's death. The court proceedings would bring up difficult truths, but it was necessary. Emily's family, friends, and the people who had loved her would ensure that her memory was honored and that justice was served for her senseless and tragic murder. David Foster, the charming man who had once seemed like a potential love interest, would face the consequences of his actions in the courtroom. But no verdict, no punishment, could ever bring Emily back. As the trial of David Foster unfolded in the months following his arrest, the courtroom became a tense and emotional place. The prosecution's case was built around the chilling evidence that had been discovered in David's cottage: his journal, the photos, and the unsettling emails between him and Emily, all pointing to a dangerous obsession that had spiraled out of control. The prosecution emphasized how David's need to control Emily had turned from mere manipulation into violent action. They argued that Emily's attempt to break free from his suffocating grasp had cost her life. For the defense, David's attorney tried to portray him as a man who had lost control in a moment of emotional distress. They argued that the murder was not premeditated, but the result of an intense emotional breakdown, a man pushed too far by rejection and fear of abandonment. They acknowledged David's history of failed relationships and the disturbing obsession he had developed with Emily, but they asked the jury to consider whether he had intended to kill her in the first place. Instead, they suggested the death was a tragic accident in the heat of an argument. However, the jury was unconvinced. The evidence, especially the disturbing journal entries and the pattern of controlling behavior, painted a clear picture of premeditation. David had planned to silence Emily's growing desire for independence, and when she resisted, he reacted violently. The lack of remorse in his actions, disposing of her body and attempting to cover up the crime, only further strengthened the prosecution's argument that this had been a calculated murder. Throughout the trial, Emily's family remained a constant presence in the courtroom. Her parents, still reeling from the shock of losing their daughter, sat in silence as the details of her death were revealed. Emily's mother, in particular, had been vocal in her determination to see justice done. She spoke to the press after every hearing, insisting that no one forget who Emily had been, a kind-hearted woman with a bright future ahead of her, not a victim of some random act of violence. For them, the pain of knowing that their daughter had died at the hands of someone she had trusted was unbearable. No amount of justice could bring her back, but they hoped that the trial would at least bring some measure of closure. In the end, the jury found David Foster guilty of first-degree murder. The judge, recognizing the severity of his crime, sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict was met with mixed emotions. While the conviction brought some semblance of justice, it did little to ease the grief of those who had loved Emily. Her family and friends, though relieved that David would never harm anyone else again, were still left with the heartbreaking reality of her absence. After the trial, the town of Evergreen slowly began to heal. The tragedy had left its mark on the community, and there was a new awareness of the darker side of relationships. The case prompted local organizations to begin offering more resources for victims of domestic abuse and unhealthy relationships. While the town had been shaken by Emily's murder, it had also sparked conversations about the importance of recognizing signs of emotional manipulation and controlling behavior before it escalated to violence. Emily's friends and family set up a memorial fund in her name, dedicated to raising awareness about relationship violence and providing support for those who found themselves in similar situations. They worked tirelessly to honor her memory, hoping that the legacy of Emily Clark would help prevent other tragedies like hers from happening in the future. David Foster, meanwhile, was left to reflect on his actions behind bars. The man who had once been seen as a charming, well-mannered newcomer was now known for the terrible crime he had committed. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, cut off from the world he had once tried to control. For Emily, there was no chance for redemption, no second chance. She had become another statistic in a long line of women whose lives had been taken by men who couldn't bear to let go. For Emily's family, the pain of her loss would never fully dissipate. There would be no more late-night phone calls, no more coffee dates with friends, no more projects or dreams left unfinished. All that remained were memories, but even those had been tainted by the way she had been taken from them. Still, they clung to the good parts, the way Emily had made them laugh, her talent, her ambition, and the love she had shared with those closest to her. As for Evergreen, life continued on, but it was impossible to ignore the shadow of what had happened. The town would always remember Emily Clark, not just as the victim of a senseless crime, but as a woman who had been taken far too soon. Her story, while tragic, served as a stark reminder of the dangers that lurked beneath the surface of seemingly normal lives, and the dark obsession that could lie hidden in the heart of a person who appeared harmless at first. David Foster had tried to erase Emily from his life, but he could not erase her from the memories of those who had known and loved her. Emily's name would not be forgotten, and the lessons learned from her tragic death would live on, shaping the community and inspiring others to be vigilant, to speak out, and to never underestimate the warning signs of an unhealthy relationship. In the end, it was Emily's legacy, the love she gave, the joy she brought, and the tragedy of her loss that would define her. She would not be just another victim. She would be a reminder to the world that love should never hurt, and no one should ever feel trapped in a relationship where control and obsession take precedence over mutual respect and trust. Story 5. In July 2000, the city of Dallas, Texas, was thrust into a media frenzy when a gruesome crime shook the community. The case involved the tragic death of a beloved local journalist, Katherine Miller, whose body was discovered in the early hours of July 12, 2000, in her downtown apartment. Katherine, 34, was known for her investigative work at one of the city's major newspapers, where she had gained recognition for her courage and relentless pursuit of the truth. Her colleagues described her as passionate about her work, often working late into the night, and committed to bringing justice to the overlooked and voiceless members of society. Katherine had lived alone in a modern high-rise apartment building in the heart of Dallas. It was a luxurious space, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered sweeping views of the city skyline. She had been living there for about 3 years, and from all accounts, she was well-liked by neighbors and had a peaceful, quiet lifestyle. Katherine had a tight-knit group of friends, though her work often left her with little time for socializing. Despite her busy career, she kept a low profile when off-duty, preferring a few close relationships to wide social circles. On the morning of July 12th, Katherine's neighbor, an elderly woman who lived across the hall, grew concerned when she hadn't seen Katherine leave her apartment that morning. Normally, Katherine would leave early to catch the subway to work, but today, there was no sign of her. The neighbor knocked on the door, but received no response. After several more attempts, the neighbor, who had grown increasingly uneasy, called the building's management, requesting a wellness check. When the building's superintendent arrived and opened the door to Katherine's apartment, what he found was shocking. The room was in disarray, the kind of scene that immediately made it clear this was no accidental death. Katherine's body was lying on the living room floor, surrounded by overturned furniture, her clothes torn and stained with blood. The apartment was ransacked, with drawers pulled out and papers scattered across the floor. There were signs of a struggle, and it was immediately apparent that Katherine had been violently attacked. However, there was no sign of forced entry, which suggested that Katherine may have known her attacker, or worse, had invited them in. The police were quickly called to the scene. Detectives arrived and began to process the apartment, collecting evidence and piecing together what had happened. It was clear from the outset that this was a homicide. Katherine's body had been brutally assaulted. She had been struck repeatedly with a blunt object, and there were signs of strangulation. The forensic team found traces of hair and fibers in various parts of the apartment, which they carefully catalogued for future analysis. The investigation into Katherine's death began almost immediately, but the police were faced with several challenges. First, there were very few clues to go on. The lack of forced entry made it unlikely that the killer was a stranger, which narrowed the list of potential suspects to people Katherine knew. However, Katherine had kept a relatively low profile in her personal life, and there were no known enemies or anyone who had a motive to harm her. Her work had occasionally involved controversial stories, but there was no direct indication that her journalism had made her a target. Her last story, which had been published just days before her death, had exposed corruption in the local police department. While some of her colleagues speculated that this might have played a role in her murder, there was no direct evidence linking her death to her work. As the investigation progressed, the police began to interview Katherine's friends, family, and colleagues. One of the first people they spoke to was Sarah Daniels, Katherine's closest friend and confidant. Sarah, a fellow journalist, told the police that she had spoken to Katherine just hours before her death. The two women had been discussing a new story Katherine was working on, one that involved a prominent local businessman named Richard Grayson. Grayson was a self-made millionaire who owned a chain of high-end restaurants in the city, but rumors had circulated about his involvement in shady business dealings. Katherine had been investigating him for several months, but she had kept her findings close to the vest, warning only a few people in her inner circle that she was getting close to uncovering something major. According to Sarah, Katherine had been particularly wary of Grayson, telling her that she suspected he might be involved in illegal activities, but she hadn't yet gathered enough proof to go public with the story. Katherine was determined, though, and had confided in Sarah that she was planning to meet with a source the following day who could potentially provide her with the smoking gun she needed. She had even mentioned that she would be meeting Richard Grayson that evening for what she called a face-to-face confrontation. Katherine had not given details about the meeting, but Sarah knew that Katherine had a history of using her charm and assertiveness to get information from high-profile individuals. At first, the idea that Richard Grayson might be involved in Katherine's murder seemed far-fetched. Grayson was a well-known figure in Dallas, and while rumors about his business practices were common, he had always managed to avoid any real legal trouble. However, the police decided to follow up on the lead, hoping it might provide some insight into Katherine's death. They reached out to Grayson's representatives and arranged an interview with him. When Grayson was brought in for questioning, he initially seemed cooperative, though he was noticeably uncomfortable. He denied knowing anything about Katherine's murder and insisted that he had never met her in person, despite her having written about him in several of her recent articles. Grayson's alibi for the night of Katherine's death seemed solid. He had been at an event hosted by one of his business partners, with multiple witnesses confirming his presence. Still, something about his demeanor didn't sit right with the detectives. Grayson was evasive when asked about his recent interactions with Katherine, and the police couldn't help but feel that he was hiding something. The breakthrough in the case came when the forensic team completed their analysis of the hair and fibers found at the crime scene. Among the samples was a strand of hair that didn't belong to Katherine. After running it through the database, they discovered a match. The hair belonged to a man with a criminal record, a former employee of one of Richard Grayson's restaurants. This man, a cook named Marcus Blackwell, had been fired from Grayson's establishment months earlier under mysterious circumstances. When the police dug deeper into Marcus's background, they found that he had a history of violence and had been arrested several times for assault. They also discovered that Marcus had a connection to Katherine. He had been a source for one of her earlier investigative stories about labor practices at local businesses, including Grayson's restaurant chain. The investigation took a new turn as the police learned that Marcus had been in contact with Katherine in the days leading up to her death. He had been upset about the way Grayson had treated him after his firing and had made several threats against him. The police were now certain that Marcus had been involved in Katherine's murder, but the question remained: what role had Richard Grayson played in all of this? Did he hire Marcus to intimidate Katherine, or go even further? The investigation into Marcus Blackwell's involvement in Katherine Miller's murder quickly intensified as the detectives pieced together his movements in the days leading up to her death. As more evidence came to light, it became increasingly clear that Marcus had not acted alone. The police found a series of phone calls between Marcus and a number associated with Richard Grayson's office, and the content of those calls suggested that there was more to their relationship than just the common connection of the restaurant. Grayson had been in frequent contact with Marcus in the week before Katherine's death, and that raised more suspicion about his potential role in the murder. Grayson had continued to deny any involvement, maintaining that he didn't know Katherine beyond the few times she had written about his businesses. However, the evidence began to mount against him. Surveillance footage from the night of Katherine's murder revealed that a car matching Grayson's vehicle had been seen parked near her apartment building around the time of the crime. While the footage did not show Grayson himself, it confirmed that someone connected to him was at the scene. When detectives revisited Marcus's phone records, they discovered that he had made multiple calls to Grayson's phone on the evening of the murder, just hours before Katherine's body was discovered. Detectives now began to believe that Grayson had orchestrated the attack on Katherine, using Marcus as an unwitting accomplice. The motive was clear: Katherine's investigation into Grayson's business dealings, particularly the shady practices at his restaurants, had threatened to expose him. Grayson, who had built a reputation as a respected businessman, feared that any negative publicity could ruin his empire. The timing of Katherine's murder suggested that it was a preemptive strike. He had to silence her before her investigation reached its conclusion. Marcus, for his part, had a clear motive for seeking revenge on Grayson after being fired from his job under humiliating circumstances. But it seemed that he had been manipulated into believing that taking part in the murder would somehow serve his own interests. The breakthrough came when investigators located Marcus, who had gone into hiding after Katherine's body was found. When they arrested him, he was initially tight-lipped, refusing to talk. But after hours of questioning, Marcus finally cracked under pressure. He admitted to being present at Katherine's apartment on the night she died. However, his story differed significantly from the police's version of events. According to Marcus, Grayson had been the one to pull the strings. He claimed that Grayson had threatened him, telling him that his involvement in the murder would erase his debts and clear the way for him to start fresh. Marcus, desperate and afraid of further retribution from Grayson, had been lured into helping. Marcus's account of the night of the murder was chilling. He claimed that Grayson had paid him to break into Katherine's apartment and intimidate her, hoping to scare her into dropping the investigation. Grayson, he said, had made it clear that it wasn't supposed to be violent. He just wanted Katherine to back off. But once inside, the situation had escalated. Marcus claimed that Katherine had fought back fiercely, screaming and struggling as he tried to subdue her. Grayson had appeared at the scene shortly after Marcus had gained access to the apartment. The two men had argued, and it was then that Marcus claimed Grayson had ordered him to finish it. Grayson had insisted that Marcus kill Katherine, claiming it was the only way to ensure that she wouldn't expose him. Under duress, Marcus had reluctantly followed Grayson's orders, and together, they had brutally attacked her. Despite Marcus's confession, the police continued to gather evidence to build a case against Grayson. They were convinced that he had masterminded the murder, and that Marcus had been nothing more than a pawn in a larger scheme. As they delved deeper into Grayson's financial and personal records, they uncovered damning evidence of his involvement in illegal activities. Hidden offshore accounts, suspicious transactions, and ties to organized crime made it clear that Grayson's empire was built on lies and corruption. His desire to keep his secrets hidden, and his willingness to go to any lengths to protect them, became the key to understanding his motive. A forensic investigation also revealed that Grayson's fingerprints had been found on several items in Katherine's apartment, including a glass that had been on the coffee table in the living room. While Grayson had denied ever being in her apartment, the evidence proved otherwise. The discovery of his fingerprints, combined with Marcus's testimony, left little doubt that Grayson had played an active role in the crime. The police arrested Richard Grayson on July 18, 2000, just 6 days after Katherine's murder. The arrest was met with shock and disbelief from the community. Grayson had been a well-respected public figure, known for his philanthropic work and reputation as a successful businessman. The idea that such a man could be involved in such a horrific crime seemed impossible. But the mounting evidence told a different story. As Grayson was led out of his mansion in handcuffs, the press descended on the scene, eager to cover the dramatic turn of events. Grayson maintained his innocence, but his public statements seemed increasingly desperate. He denied any involvement in Katherine's murder, claiming that Marcus had acted alone and that he had been unaware of the plan to kill her. However, the detectives were confident in their case. They had already pieced together a timeline of events, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Katherine's family, though devastated by her death, found some semblance of peace in the fact that the people responsible for her murder were being held accountable. Her parents, particularly her father, expressed their relief that Grayson had been arrested. They had watched their daughter work tirelessly to uncover the truth, often putting herself in dangerous situations to expose corruption. The idea that her own life had been taken to protect a lie was almost too much to bear. But knowing that justice was finally being served was a small comfort. As the days passed, the case continued to dominate headlines. The investigation into Grayson's ties to organized crime and his corrupt business practices deepened. While the legal proceedings were ongoing, the city of Dallas was forced to reckon with the darker side of its celebrated business culture. It became evident that Katherine's murder was not just a personal tragedy. It was a reflection of the lengths to which some individuals would go to maintain power and control. The trial would take several more months, but by the time it began, the facts were clear. Richard Grayson was a man driven by greed, ego, and a desperate desire to protect his empire. His cold and calculating actions had led to the death of an innocent woman, someone who had been devoted to exposing the truth. And despite the pain and heartbreak that Katherine's family and friends had endured, they knew that she had not died in vain. Her work had uncovered the corruption that had been festering beneath the surface of the city's elite, and it was her determination that had brought the truth to light. As the trial of Richard Grayson began, the city of Dallas once again found itself captivated by the case that had stunned its residents. The courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and law enforcement officials, all eager to see justice done for Katherine Miller. The prosecution's case was robust, bolstered by the damning evidence that had been uncovered in the investigation. Grayson, the once respected businessman, sat in the defendant's chair, his demeanor cold and calculated, as if detached from the gravity of the situation. His legal team worked tirelessly to undermine the prosecution's case, attempting to cast doubt on Marcus Blackwell's testimony and paint him as an unreliable witness. However, as the trial progressed, it became increasingly apparent that Grayson's own actions and lies would ultimately seal his fate. The prosecution's argument centered around the idea that Grayson had used Marcus Blackwell as a pawn, manipulating him into committing murder to protect his vast criminal enterprise. The evidence was overwhelming. From the phone records showing Grayson's communication with Marcus on the night of the murder, to the forensic evidence linking him to Katherine's apartment, it was clear that Grayson had orchestrated the crime. The most compelling piece of evidence came from Marcus, who, in a tearful testimony, described how Grayson had pressured him to act, insisting that killing Katherine was the only way to protect his empire and keep his secrets safe. Marcus's emotional breakdown in the courtroom was difficult to watch. He admitted that he had been caught in a dangerous web of manipulation, initially believing that helping Grayson would somehow benefit him. His remorse was palpable as he recounted how he had been coerced into carrying out the brutal attack. The defense, unable to discredit Marcus's testimony, shifted their focus to portraying Grayson as a man who had been a victim of circumstance. They argued that while Grayson's behavior was questionable, he had never intended for Katherine to be killed. They claimed that Marcus, in a fit of rage, had taken things too far when the confrontation between the two men escalated. It was a defense that felt weak and unconvincing in the face of such strong evidence. As the trial continued, the courtroom became a battleground for the competing narratives of justice. The prosecution painted Grayson as a ruthless and power-hungry individual who had killed to maintain his position at the top, while the defense sought to create doubt and suggest that Grayson's involvement was not as direct as it seemed. The tension was thick, and every day brought new revelations that chipped away at Grayson's carefully constructed facade of respectability. For Katherine's family, the trial was an emotional ordeal. Her parents, who had already endured the unbearable pain of losing their daughter, now had to relive the horrific details of her death. They sat in the courtroom each day, their faces etched with sorrow, but they were determined to see the case through to the end. Emily, Katherine's younger sister, spoke to reporters after one of the hearings, expressing her frustration at the defense's attempt to minimize Grayson's role in her sister's murder. "My sister was not just a victim of a random act of violence," Emily said, her voice shaking with emotion. "She was murdered by a man who thought he could get away with it, but we will make sure he doesn't." As the days turned into weeks, the evidence continued to mount. Forensic experts testified about the DNA found at the crime scene, linking Grayson to the murder. The prosecution also introduced a series of emails and text messages between Grayson and Marcus that revealed the extent of their interactions in the days leading up to the murder. These messages painted a clear picture of Grayson's obsession with silencing Katherine before she could expose his criminal activities. It became increasingly clear that the murder had not been a spur-of-the-moment decision, but a calculated act driven by fear and greed. One of the most powerful moments in the trial came when Katherine's colleagues from the newspaper took the stand. They spoke passionately about her work, her dedication to uncovering the truth, and the impact she had made on the city. Her editor, a man named Jack Thompson, told the court how Katherine had been relentless in her pursuit of a story about corruption in the city's business elite, often putting herself in danger to expose the truth. He spoke about her fearlessness in the face of powerful people who tried to intimidate her into backing down. Jack's voice cracked as he remembered Katherine's final moments at the office, when she had expressed her determination to finish the story, no matter the cost. "She wasn't afraid of them," Jack said. "She was afraid of what would happen if she didn't do the right thing." By the end of the trial, the prosecution had presented a compelling case. There was no longer any doubt in the minds of the jury that Richard Grayson had orchestrated the murder of Katherine Miller in cold blood. The defense had failed to present a credible alternative explanation, and the weight of the evidence had crushed any chance of Grayson's acquittal. As the jury deliberated, Katherine's family anxiously waited for the verdict, knowing that this moment would bring them either a measure of justice or a reminder of the pain that would never fully leave them. When the verdict was finally delivered, it was clear that the jury had reached the only conclusion possible. Richard Grayson was found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and several other charges related to his criminal activities. The judge, in a stern and unwavering voice, sentenced Grayson to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in a mix of emotion. For Katherine's family, there was a sense of relief, but also a profound sadness that no amount of justice could bring their daughter back. The life she had worked so hard to build, the future she had dreamed of, had been taken from her far too soon. As Grayson was led away in handcuffs, his face expressionless, Katherine's family and friends finally allowed themselves to breathe. It had been a long, painful journey, but the truth had been revealed. For them, the trial had been a necessary step toward closure, but it would never replace the emptiness left by her loss. Katherine Miller had been a journalist, a sister, a daughter, and a friend. She had dedicated her life to uncovering the truth, and even in death, she had succeeded in doing just that. In the months that followed, the city of Dallas began to heal, but the memory of Katherine's murder lingered. Her legacy lived on in the stories she had written, the lives she had touched, and the truth she had uncovered. Her family established a foundation in her honor, focused on supporting investigative journalists and promoting press freedom. They hoped that Katherine's story would serve as a reminder to others of the importance of seeking the truth, no matter the cost. As for Marcus Blackwell, he was sentenced to a reduced prison term for his role in the murder, his conviction a direct result of his cooperation with the authorities. While he had played a crucial role in bringing Grayson to justice, his actions were inexcusable, and the court made it clear that his involvement in Katherine's death could not be overlooked. Ultimately, the case of Katherine Miller was more than just a tragic murder. It was a story of corruption, manipulation, and the fight for justice. It was a reminder that the pursuit of truth often comes at a heavy price, but that in the end, truth has a way of prevailing. Story 6. In August 2000, a disturbing and mysterious crime gripped the small town of Oakwood, Ohio. It began as a missing persons case, but quickly escalated into a chilling story of betrayal, deception, and murder that would leave the entire community shaken. The victim, 36-year-old Laura Bennett, was a beloved local schoolteacher who had taught at Oakwood Middle School for over a decade. Known for her kind-hearted nature, dedication to her students, and involvement in various community activities, her disappearance shocked everyone who knew her. What seemed like a simple case of a woman who may have wandered off or encountered an accident soon turned into something far darker. The day Laura was last seen, she had been preparing for a weekend getaway with her fiancé, Mark Stevens. The two had been engaged for just 6 months, and their relationship seemed picture-perfect to everyone who knew them. They had plans to take a trip to a nearby lake cabin for a few days of relaxation before the school year began. But on the morning of August 10, 2000, Laura's colleagues at the school noticed that she hadn't shown up for work. At first, no one thought much of it. It wasn't unusual for people to take last-minute days off, and Laura was known to be a bit of a planner, so perhaps she had decided to leave early for the trip. But as the hours passed, the situation began to feel increasingly odd. Mark Stevens, who had been in constant contact with Laura the night before, couldn't be reached. His phone went straight to voicemail, and he didn't respond to any of Laura's friends or family members who began to inquire about her whereabouts. By that evening, panic set in. Laura's mother, Karen Bennett, called the local police and reported her daughter missing. The police initially assumed that Laura had simply gotten lost during her travels, or that she was taking some time for herself. But as the investigation unfolded, they quickly realized that something was horribly wrong. The first breakthrough came when Laura's car was found abandoned on the side of a rural road, not far from Oakwood. The car was locked, and there were no signs of forced entry or a struggle. Inside, the police discovered a few personal items: Laura's purse, her phone, and an unopened bottle of water. There was no indication that Laura had planned to stop there, and nothing appeared to be out of the ordinary. The lack of any signs of distress or violence in the car made it seem even more puzzling. The investigators began to wonder if perhaps she had been the victim of an accident, or if there was some other explanation. The investigation took a dark turn when the police discovered a series of cryptic text messages between Laura and Mark, which had been sent the evening before her disappearance. The texts were innocuous at first, but as they continued, they became more unsettling. Mark had sent a message just after midnight saying, "You don't know what I've done." Laura responded with confusion, asking him what he meant, but he did not reply. In the morning, the text stopped altogether. After speaking with family members, it was revealed that Laura and Mark had been arguing in the days leading up to her disappearance. According to her friends, Laura had been increasingly distant, often talking about her concerns regarding Mark's behavior. He had been acting strangely for weeks, becoming more possessive and controlling. Laura had also confided in one of her colleagues that she was beginning to feel uncomfortable with the relationship, but she hadn't yet decided how to address it. With this new information, the police turned their attention to Mark. They traced his movements on the day of Laura's disappearance and found that he had been unaccounted for during the crucial hours when she was last seen. His phone records showed that he had been in the area of the abandoned car, but he had not mentioned it to anyone. The search for Laura intensified, and the police began to search areas near the rural road where her car had been found, hoping to uncover more evidence. Days passed with no sign of Laura, and the case began to draw media attention. Oakwood, a town where violent crimes were almost unheard of, was now the center of national headlines. People who knew Laura were desperate for answers, but as the investigation continued, more unsettling details about Mark's past began to emerge. Mark Stevens had a history of troubled relationships. His previous girlfriends had reported strange behavior, including instances of jealousy, stalking, and controlling actions. One former girlfriend had even obtained a restraining order against him after he had repeatedly shown up at her workplace and followed her around town. While this information was not immediately available to the police, it soon became a key part of the investigation. The authorities began to look more closely at Mark's criminal history, which included a series of minor offenses related to harassment and intimidation. On August 16th, a breakthrough came when Mark Stevens was arrested after he was caught trying to sell Laura's car at a local dealership. He had been attempting to forge the vehicle's title and was discovered when the dealer became suspicious of the paperwork. After his arrest, Mark initially denied any involvement in Laura's disappearance, claiming that she had left him and was now somewhere out of town. However, the police had already gathered enough evidence to press charges. They obtained a search warrant for his apartment, where they uncovered a chilling collection of items. Among the items were photographs of Laura taken without her knowledge, a stash of love letters from Mark to her, and a journal that detailed his obsessive thoughts and fantasies about their relationship. The most damning evidence, however, was found when police uncovered a hidden storage unit rented in Mark's name. Inside the unit were several items that belonged to Laura, including her suitcase, a set of her clothing, and a small box of personal mementos. The most disturbing item was a blood-stained shirt that matched the fabric of Laura's clothing, found alongside a pair of shoes with traces of blood on them. The discovery of these items suggested that Laura had met with foul play, and Mark was no longer seen as a mere suspect, but as the prime perpetrator of her disappearance. The investigation had now shifted from a missing persons case to a murder investigation. Mark Stevens was charged with the murder of Laura Bennett, as well as multiple counts of kidnapping and theft. He was held without bail as the police worked to gather more evidence and prepare for his trial. While the community of Oakwood was left in shock and disbelief, the case served as a stark reminder of how deeply hidden some secrets can be, and how far someone will go when driven by jealousy and obsession. As the police prepared to charge Mark, they continued their search for Laura's body, determined to bring her home and give her family the closure they desperately needed. While they had gathered substantial evidence pointing to Mark's guilt, the location of Laura's remained a mystery. The case was far from over, but the small town of Oakwood was left wondering how such a horrifying crime could have happened so close to home, and what had driven Mark Stevens to kill the woman he had once professed to love. As the investigation into Laura Bennett's disappearance continued to unfold, the search for her body intensified. Mark Stevens had been arrested, and the town of Oakwood was in disbelief over the tragic turn of events. It was hard for anyone who knew Laura to believe that the man she had been in a relationship with, the man she had been planning a future with, could have been capable of something so horrific. People still remembered the way he had acted in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, calm, composed, and seemingly affectionate. The signs had been subtle, but in hindsight, Those close to Laura could see the cracks in the facade. The investigators had their work cut out for them. With Mark's arrest and the mounting evidence against him, the police were determined to find Laura's body and confirm the suspicions they had. Forensic teams combed through every inch of Mark's apartment, his car, and any other properties associated with him. But it was the discovery of the hidden storage unit that proved to be the key to understanding just how deep Mark's obsession had run. The items found there, each one a chilling reminder of the man's fixation on Laura, painted a picture of a troubled mind that had slowly spiraled out of control. Mark had meticulously documented his thoughts in a series of journals, which were now being examined by investigators. As they read through the pages, they found detailed accounts of his growing obsession with Laura. His writings described the intense feelings of possessiveness he had developed over time, and his belief that Laura was the only person who truly understood him. It was clear that, over the course of their relationship, Mark's love for her had turned into something far darker. He began to write about the fear of losing her, of being abandoned. His jealousy had started to consume him, and his insecurities had led to constant monitoring of her whereabouts. Laura had mentioned, in conversations with her friends, that Mark would often show up uninvited at places she visited, or demand to know the details of her interactions with others. The deeper the investigators dug into Mark's background, the more disturbing details emerged. He had been obsessed with Laura from the very beginning, always keeping a close eye on her even before they had become a couple. He had followed her on social media, keeping track of every post she made, every photo she shared. His fixation with her extended beyond the real world and into the virtual one. But it wasn't just that he had been constantly checking up on her. It was the way he had manipulated her feelings. Laura, in the months leading up to her disappearance, had begun to notice the subtle shifts in Mark's behavior. He had become more controlling and demanding, expecting constant attention and reassurance from her. When Laura had expressed concerns to a few close friends, they advised her to confront Mark, but she had hesitated. She didn't want to hurt him, and she believed that things would get better with time. It was a tragic mistake. Laura had been planning to take some time away from him during their upcoming weekend trip, hoping to gain some perspective and distance from the increasingly toxic dynamic of their relationship. As the police combed through the evidence, they also focused on Mark's movements during the critical days surrounding Laura's disappearance. They found that he had been deliberately vague about his whereabouts, and the inconsistencies in his statements were becoming more and more apparent. Mark claimed that after he had dropped Laura off to go for a walk at the lake, he had gone back home, unaware of what had happened to her. But his alibi fell apart when his phone records showed that he had been near a remote area on the outskirts of Oakwood, in close proximity to where Laura's car had been found. Further investigation revealed that Mark had lied about his actions that day. He had been at a location far more significant than he had let on. On the 21st of August, a breakthrough came when a hiker discovered human remains in a wooded area near the lake. The body was partially hidden under a pile of leaves, and it was clear that the person had been dead for several days. A forensics team was immediately dispatched to the site, and after conducting a thorough examination, they confirmed the identity of the body as Laura Bennett. The discovery was a tragic confirmation of what the police had suspected all along. The condition of the body suggested that Laura had been killed shortly after her disappearance. There were no obvious signs of external trauma, but an autopsy would later reveal that she had been strangled, her life taken by someone who had been in a position of trust. Mark Stevens, who had been questioned again after the discovery, initially maintained his innocence, but the mounting evidence was impossible to ignore. The police had already found items in his apartment and storage unit that placed him directly at the scene, and now they had the final piece of the puzzle, the discovery of Laura's body. As the news of Laura's death spread through Oakwood, the town was engulfed in a mixture of grief, shock, and anger. Laura had been such a beloved figure in the community. Her students adored her, and her colleagues spoke of her warmth and generosity. No one could understand how a man who had seemed so charming, so normal, could commit such a violent crime. Mark Stevens, once the charming fiancé, was now a cold-blooded murderer. The trial of Mark Stevens began in early 2001. As the evidence against him mounted, the defense attempted to argue that Mark had acted in a fit of temporary insanity, blaming his actions on his obsessive attachment to Laura. They suggested that he had lost control in a moment of jealousy, and that his love for her had led him to commit an unthinkable act. But the prosecution countered with a strong argument, focusing on Mark's premeditated actions, his careful planning, and his deliberate attempt to cover up the crime. The evidence of his growing obsession, along with the discovery of the hidden storage unit, painted a picture of a man who had meticulously crafted his own version of a perfect relationship, one in which he controlled every aspect of Laura's life, right down to her very existence. Mark Stevens was convicted of first-degree murder, and his sentencing sent shockwaves through Oakwood. He was given the maximum sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. But for the residents of Oakwood, the sentence was not enough. Nothing could bring Laura back, and nothing could erase the pain of her senseless death. The town would never be the same. In the aftermath, Laura's family, especially her mother Karen, struggled to cope with the loss of a daughter they had raised with so much love and care. But they found solace in the support of their community and the knowledge that justice had been served. The memory of Laura Bennett, the teacher, the friend, the sister, would live on in the hearts of those who had known her. And for Oakwood, the tragic death of Laura Bennett served as a grim reminder of the hidden dangers that can lurk behind even the most seemingly perfect relationships. As the months passed after the conviction of Mark Stevens, the town of Oakwood slowly began to rebuild itself, though it would never fully recover from the tragedy that had unfolded. The ripple effects of Laura Bennett's murder were felt by everyone who had known her, especially her family, who had to live with the painful reminder of the daughter they had lost. Her mother, Karen, struggled with overwhelming grief, but remained steadfast in her commitment to honor Laura's memory. She started a scholarship fund in Laura's name, which would help underprivileged students attend Oakwood Middle School, continuing the legacy of a teacher who had touched so many lives. It was a way for Karen to channel her sorrow into something positive, something that could benefit others in a way her daughter would have wanted. Laura's friends and colleagues also found their own ways of coping. Many of them attended support groups for those who had experienced the loss of a loved one through violence. They held vigils in Laura's memory and organized events to raise awareness about domestic violence and the dangers of controlling relationships, issues that had been overlooked in the early stages of the investigation. It became clear to many of them that while Mark Stevens had physically taken Laura's life, he had also stripped her of the voice she had once so freely expressed. Her death was a tragic reminder of the power dynamics that often exist in relationships, and how easily they could turn deadly. In the years that followed, Oakwood would change. The small town, once known for its peaceful atmosphere, became more cautious, more aware of the hidden dangers that could lie beneath the surface of a seemingly perfect relationship. The case served as a wake-up call for the community, forcing people to examine their own relationships and those around them. Support for domestic abuse victims became a focal point for local organizations, and several new initiatives were launched to educate the public on the signs of unhealthy relationships and the importance of speaking out before things escalated. For Mark Stevens, life behind bars was a grim existence. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and his once bright future came crashing down. In prison, he faced the consequences of his actions. The inmate population made it clear that Mark was not well liked. There was no sympathy for someone who had taken the life of a woman in such a brutal and calculated manner. He spent most of his time isolated from other prisoners, as many refused to associate with him, disgusted by his crime. Even though Mark had once been a charming and well-liked individual in Oakwood, that image was forever shattered. His obsession with Laura, which he had carefully concealed for years, was now fully exposed for the world to see. He became a symbol of the dangers of possessive love, a cautionary tale of how someone's need for control could destroy not only another person's life, but their own as well. In the prison system, Mark faced a bleak and solitary future. He had no supporters, no friends, and little hope of ever seeing freedom again. The only solace he seemed to find was in the occasional letters from his family, letters that expressed their disappointment and anger, but also their continued love. It was a strange, tragic paradox. They had lost their son to the very actions that he had committed, and now they were left to mourn a man who was no longer the person they had once known. The trial, the conviction, and the subsequent media coverage had left an indelible mark on everyone involved. The story of Laura's murder was told and retold in countless headlines, news reports, and documentaries, making it one of the most talked-about crimes of the year. But even as the legal proceedings came to a close, the pain of Laura's death would linger long after the final gavel fell. Karen Bennett, who had once been a vibrant woman full of hope and optimism, had changed forever. Her grief never fully dissipated. Every milestone, her daughter's birthday, the anniversaries of the day she disappeared, and the day the verdict was handed down, served as painful reminders of what she had lost. But in her heart, Karen knew that she had to keep going for Laura. She would continue to speak out for other victims of domestic violence, using her daughter's story to shed light on an issue that had once been hidden in the shadows. Laura's name would never be forgotten. In the years that followed, Oakwood held its breath every time a story of domestic abuse or violent crime made the news. Though the town had tried to return to normal, the shadow of Laura's death still loomed large. People kept an eye on one another more carefully, and a heightened sense of vigilance hung in the air. Mark Stevens' actions had forever altered the fabric of their community, leaving behind a trail of destruction that could never be undone. For Laura Bennett, justice had been served. Mark was behind bars, and the community had rallied to ensure her memory lived on. The scholarship, the awareness campaigns, and the lessons learned from her tragic death ensured that Laura's legacy was not in vain. As the years passed, Laura became more than just a victim. She was a symbol of strength, a beacon for those who had suffered in silence, and a reminder that the end of one life could spark the beginning of change for many others. And though Laura's absence could never be filled, those who had known her continued to carry her spirit forward. In the classrooms where she once taught, in the hallways of Oakwood Middle School, and in the hearts of her family and friends, Laura Bennett lived on. Story 7. In September 2000, a case emerged that would capture the attention of the nation, shaking a quiet suburban community to its core. The small town of Hillcrest, nestled in the rolling hills of the Midwest, had always been known for its tranquility and close-knit families. But everything changed when a woman, Sarah Mitchell, was reported missing on September 7th, a disappearance that would unravel a story of hidden lives, betrayal, and the dark undercurrents of suburban life. Sarah, a 32-year-old schoolteacher, had lived in Hillcrest for most of her life. She was well liked by her colleagues and students, known for her kindness and dedication to education. Married to her high school sweetheart, John Mitchell, the couple seemed to lead the picture-perfect life, one that anyone would envy. They lived in a charming two-story house on Oak Street, surrounded by manicured lawns and picket fences, with a golden retriever named Max to complete their family. However, on the morning of September 7th, Sarah's friends and family became alarmed when she didn't show up for work. She had been absent without explanation, and no one could reach her on her cell phone. The last time anyone had heard from her was the evening before, when she had talked to her sister, Emily, about an argument she'd had with John earlier in the week. Sarah had mentioned that they had been having some problems, but didn't go into detail. Emily, concerned but not thinking much of it at the time, had urged her to talk to John and try to work things out. When Sarah didn't show up for work the next day, Emily immediately called her brother-in-law, John, and asked if he had seen Sarah. He said he hadn't heard from her since the night before, and he was equally worried. They agreed to meet at the house and check on her. As they arrived at Sarah and John's home, they noticed that her car was still parked in the driveway, and the front door was locked. There were no signs of forced entry or struggle, but Sarah was nowhere to be found. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. John, now visibly distressed, called the police. Officers arrived at the scene within minutes, but despite an extensive search of the home and the surrounding area, there were no clues as to where Sarah could have gone. There were no signs of violence or forced entry, and nothing appeared to be out of place in the house. However, the police discovered that Sarah's purse, her wallet, and her phone were all left behind, suggesting that she hadn't left voluntarily. The initial investigation into Sarah's disappearance was treated as a missing person case. However, as the hours and days dragged on with no sign of her, the police began to suspect that something more sinister was at play. The investigators spoke to John, but his account of the events surrounding Sarah's disappearance seemed vague and inconsistent. He claimed that he had last seen her the night before, when they had gone to bed together. According to John, Sarah had seemed upset, but he didn't know why. He said that he had woken up that morning to find her gone, with no note or explanation. Detectives were skeptical of John's story. They noted his apparent calmness and lack of emotion, which seemed unusual given the gravity of the situation. His behavior was difficult to read. He wasn't panicked or frantic the way most people would be if their spouse were missing. Instead, he seemed detached, almost like someone who wasn't deeply concerned about his wife's sudden disappearance. This raised suspicions among the investigators, who began to focus more closely on John's actions and behavior. Detective Sarah Harding, who was leading the investigation, began to dig deeper into the Mitchells' marriage. She spoke to Sarah's friends and colleagues, trying to piece together a clearer picture of the woman who had gone missing. What she learned was unsettling. According to Sarah's friends, There had been growing tension between Sarah and John in the months leading up to her disappearance. Although no one had seen any outward signs of physical abuse, Sarah had confided in a few close friends that her marriage had been deteriorating. John had become controlling and possessive, and Sarah had begun to feel trapped. She had talked about leaving him, but had been unsure about how to proceed. Detective Harding also learned that Sarah had recently opened a separate bank account, something she had not shared with John. Her colleagues at the local school recalled that Sarah had seemed withdrawn in the days leading up to her disappearance, and she had been quiet about her personal life. The couple had been married for over 10 years, but it was becoming increasingly clear that things were not as perfect as they had appeared. The investigation took a dramatic turn when the police uncovered a crucial piece of evidence, a set of disturbing text messages on Sarah's phone. The messages, sent in the days leading up to her disappearance, seemed to hint at a growing rift between Sarah and John. One message read, "I can't take this anymore. I need to leave before it's too late," while another said, "I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending." These messages were sent from Sarah's phone to her best friend, Melissa, but they had never been discussed in detail before. The text messages were a red flag, indications that Sarah had been planning to leave John, and that something had pushed her to the breaking point. As the investigation deepened, the police began to focus on John as the prime suspect. His inconsistent statements, coupled with the growing evidence that Sarah had been planning to leave him, made him appear increasingly guilty. Detective Harding and her team obtained a warrant to search the Mitchells' home, and during their search, they discovered a hidden safe in the basement. The safe contained a disturbing collection of items, including Sarah's jewelry, personal belongings, and a series of photographs of her taken without her knowledge. The photos were taken in various locations around the house, and some appeared to have been taken when Sarah was unaware. This discovery was a turning point in the case. The police had uncovered a pattern of control and obsession in John's behavior, which they believed had escalated to the point of violence. The photos suggested that John had been stalking Sarah, and the presence of her personal belongings in the safe indicated that he had been hiding them, possibly in an effort to maintain control over her, even after her disappearance. With mounting evidence against him, John Mitchell was arrested on charges of kidnapping and suspicion of murder. As the police gathered more information and interviewed witnesses, they began to piece together a chilling narrative. John had been monitoring Sarah's every move, controlling her every action, and when she finally made the decision to leave him, he had snapped. The case, which had begun as a missing person investigation, had now shifted into a full-blown homicide case. This marked the beginning of a complex and tragic case that would unfold over the coming weeks, with secrets slowly being revealed, and the truth of Sarah Mitchell's fate inching closer to the surface. As the investigation into Sarah Mitchell's disappearance deepened, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, but they painted an increasingly dark and disturbing picture of her marriage to John Mitchell. The police, now fully convinced that foul play was involved, began to uncover more disturbing details about the couple's life behind closed doors. After John Mitchell's arrest, the town of Hillcrest was shaken. Many residents who had once viewed the Mitchells as the ideal couple were stunned by the revelations about their troubled relationship. Sarah, the dedicated teacher, and John, the successful local businessman, had appeared to have it all. Yet behind the facade of their picture-perfect life, cracks had been forming for years, and now, the full extent of John's controlling and manipulative behavior was coming to light. In the days following his arrest, the police focused their attention on Sarah's personal history with John. They spoke to friends, colleagues, and family members who had witnessed subtle signs of tension in their relationship. Though the couple had never been overtly confrontational in public, it was clear to those closest to Sarah that John's possessiveness had taken a toll on her over time. According to her best friend, Melissa, Sarah had often complained that John had become increasingly controlling. She said that John would frequently monitor her whereabouts, question her about the people she spoke to, and criticize her choices. Although John had never been violent with Sarah, his psychological control had begun to wear on her, making her feel isolated and trapped in her own marriage. One of the most striking revelations came from Sarah's colleagues at the local middle school. Several teachers had witnessed Sarah's growing sense of unease in the months leading up to her disappearance. She had confided in a few of them about her plans to leave John, though she had never been specific about the details. What struck them the most was that Sarah seemed to be planning an escape, but she lacked the courage to take the final step. Her colleagues noted that she had started to withdraw socially, often avoiding group outings or gatherings where John might feel uncomfortable. She had also grown distant from her family, which raised further concerns. But no one had realized the full extent of the danger she was in. The police also learned from Sarah's sister, Emily, that Sarah had recently opened a secret bank account. This was a huge red flag for investigators. Emily explained that Sarah had confided in her about wanting to start over. She had mentioned wanting to leave John, but she had been afraid of what might happen if she did. Emily recalled a conversation they had a few months before Sarah disappeared, during which Sarah expressed her fear that John might hurt her if she tried to leave. "I don't know if he'll let me go," Sarah had said, her voice trembling with fear. Emily tried to reassure her sister, but deep down, she too was worried about the growing tension in their marriage. The discovery of Sarah's secret bank account provided a crucial lead. The police learned that Sarah had been quietly withdrawing money over the course of several weeks. She had even made arrangements to rent a small apartment in a neighboring town, where she planned to stay once she had the means to escape. But her plans had been interrupted, and investigators now wondered if John had somehow discovered her intentions before she could follow through. The deeper the investigation went, the more unsettling the details became. As the police combed through John Mitchell's personal effects, they uncovered a disturbing set of journals. John had kept meticulous records of his relationship with Sarah, chronicling every detail of their life together. At first glance, the journals seemed harmless, descriptions of family vacations, their anniversary celebrations, and the ordinary events of married life. But as investigators dug deeper, they found that John's journals revealed a chilling obsession with Sarah. In these private writings, he expressed a constant fear of losing her. He frequently mentioned his jealousy, his desire to keep her close, and his belief that she could never truly be happy without him. In many of the entries, John spoke of his intense need to control Sarah, believing that he was the only person who truly understood her. John's obsession with Sarah became more apparent as the police found additional evidence of his secretive behavior. They discovered that he had installed hidden cameras in their home, without Sarah's knowledge, to monitor her every move. These cameras were strategically placed in rooms throughout the house, including the living room, kitchen, and even the bedroom. It was a clear sign that John had been tracking Sarah's every action, confirming that his need to control her extended far beyond simple jealousy. It was a dangerous compulsion. The police also began to suspect that Sarah's disappearance was not a spur-of-the-moment act by John, but rather the culmination of weeks or even months of careful planning. According to forensic evidence, Sarah's cell phone had been turned off the night she vanished, and the phone had not been used since. The authorities were able to trace its last known location to a remote part of the woods just outside of Hillcrest, a location that was known to be secluded and difficult to access. The phone's final ping had been just miles from the Mitchells' home, but it seemed as though Sarah had disappeared into thin air after that point. On the night of September 7th, when Sarah went missing, John's whereabouts were unclear. He claimed that he had been at home all evening, though there was no way to corroborate his story. Despite the lack of physical evidence tying John directly to Sarah's disappearance, the circumstantial evidence painted a damning picture. His obsession with controlling Sarah, his secretive behavior, and his strange detachment when she went missing all pointed to one thing: John Mitchell had orchestrated his wife's disappearance. The case was starting to unravel, but the police were not yet ready to make an arrest. They needed concrete evidence to bring to court. With that in mind, they expanded their search for Sarah, including a thorough examination of the wooded area near the Mitchells' home. Forensic teams scoured the land for any signs of foul play, combing through brush and debris in the hopes of finding a clue that could lead them to Sarah's final resting place. Meanwhile, John remained in custody, his lawyer insisting that there was no evidence linking him to his wife's disappearance. He continued to deny any involvement in Sarah's vanishing, claiming that he had no idea where she could be. However, the mounting evidence against him painted a different story. The detectives had gathered enough information to charge him with the kidnapping of his wife, and their next steps would be to search for her body and bring justice to Sarah Mitchell. With each passing day, the pressure mounted on John Mitchell. The story of Sarah's disappearance continued to dominate the headlines, with the community of Hillcrest reeling from the revelation that one of their own might be capable of such a heinous act. But the truth was still out there, hidden beneath layers of lies and deception. The police were determined to find it, and as the investigation unfolded, the search for Sarah Mitchell would ultimately lead to an unimaginable discovery. As the investigation moved forward, the pressure on John Mitchell intensified. For weeks, the small town of Hillcrest was consumed by the mystery of Sarah's disappearance, with the Mitchell family at the center of it all. Neighbors, friends, and colleagues speculated about what had happened, but the authorities remained focused on the facts. Detective Harding and her team were determined to uncover the truth, knowing that they were on the verge of revealing something far darker than anyone in the town had ever imagined. Despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, John continued to deny any wrongdoing. He insisted that he had no idea where Sarah had gone, claiming that he was as perplexed as everyone else about her sudden disappearance. His demeanor, however, remained eerily calm, with little sign of the desperation one would expect from a husband whose wife had vanished without a trace. His refusal to cooperate with investigators only fueled their suspicion, and they decided it was time to dig deeper. The breakthrough came when a team of forensic specialists meticulously examined the hidden cameras John had installed in the house. While Sarah had been aware of some of the surveillance equipment, such as the cameras used to monitor the front and back yards, she had no knowledge of the covert devices that John had placed in the more private areas of the home. Investigators found hours of footage, documenting not just Sarah's daily activities, but also her interactions with John. They watched as Sarah, unaware of the hidden cameras, moved around the house, preparing meals, talking on the phone, and even having quiet moments of reflection. The footage provided a chilling window into the Mitchells' marriage. It was clear that John's obsession with Sarah had gone far beyond what anyone had initially believed. The videos showed how he would frequently enter rooms without notice, watch her from the doorway, or make subtle comments that indicated his growing control. One particularly disturbing clip revealed John speaking to Sarah in a cold, authoritarian tone as he questioned her about a phone call she had received from a male colleague. His voice was calm but forceful, and Sarah's body language suggested that she had learned to tiptoe around his volatile mood swings. Then, on September 7th, the day Sarah went missing, the investigators uncovered something even more damning, a recording from the bedroom camera that had not been discovered until later in the investigation. In this footage, John could be seen entering the room at around 3 a.m., just hours before Sarah disappeared. The video showed John standing in the doorway, staring at Sarah as she slept. He moved quietly across the room, his footsteps barely audible on the hardwood floor. At one point, he reached for the drawer where Sarah kept her personal items. The camera's angle was not ideal, but the investigators were able to make out the distinct motion of John closing the drawer with something in his hand. It was a piece of jewelry, Sarah's engagement ring. This piece of evidence was crucial. It suggested that John had been involved in Sarah's disappearance long before the police had initially thought. The camera footage confirmed what the police had suspected all along. Sarah's disappearance was not a random event. It was the result of a meticulously planned act. John had been watching his wife closely, waiting for the right moment to take control of the situation. With this new evidence, the police were able to secure a search warrant for the Mitchells' property, including the wooded area near their home that had previously been overlooked. Forensic teams arrived at the site, carefully combing through the overgrown land. After several days of painstaking work, they made a discovery that would change the course of the case. Buried beneath a thicket of trees, they found a shallow grave. The remains were quickly identified as Sarah Mitchell's. Her body had been hidden with care, as though someone had intended to keep it out of sight for as long as possible. The cause of death was later determined to be blunt force trauma, likely inflicted by a heavy object. The medical examiner concluded that Sarah had died sometime around the night of September 7th, just hours after the final footage from the bedroom camera was recorded. The news of the discovery sent shockwaves through the community. In a town where crime was rare and the Mitchells were seen as pillars of the community, no one could have imagined such a grisly outcome. The evidence that had been slowly uncovered, John's obsessive behavior, the hidden cameras, the chilling footage, had all pointed to one conclusion. John Mitchell had murdered his wife. The trial that followed was a spectacle that captivated the nation. John was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and unlawful burial of a body. The prosecution presented a compelling case, relying heavily on the forensic evidence, the surveillance footage, and the testimonies from Sarah's friends and family, who painted a picture of a woman trapped in a toxic and controlling marriage. They argued that John's obsession with Sarah had driven him to commit the unthinkable act of murder. John's defense team tried to portray him as a loving husband who had been deeply affected by the sudden disappearance of his wife. They argued that there was no direct evidence linking him to Sarah's death and suggested that she may have left him voluntarily. However, The evidence against John was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning with a guilty verdict. John Mitchell was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The case was a sobering reminder of the dark side of domestic relationships, where control and manipulation can lead to devastating consequences. For Sarah's family and friends, the loss of a beloved daughter, sister, and friend was a tragedy that would never fully heal. The community of Hillcrest, forever changed by the events of September 2000, could only mourn the loss of a woman who had been loved by so many, yet had been taken too soon by the very person who was supposed to cherish her the most. In the years that followed, Sarah's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked control in relationships. Her death sparked important conversations about domestic abuse and the often hidden signs that can precede violence. For those who knew her, the pain of losing Sarah never truly faded, but they carried her memory with them, determined to make sure that her story would never be forgotten. Story 8. In September 2000, the United States witnessed a significant legal development that would have profound implications for the criminal justice system. The case in question involved Juan Melendez, a man who had spent over 17 years on Florida's death row for a crime he did not commit. His exoneration not only highlighted the fallibility of the justice system, but also ignited a nationwide conversation about the use of the death penalty and the importance of ensuring the innocence of those sentenced to death. Juan Melendez was arrested in 1984 and convicted for the murder of Delbert Baker, a crime he steadfastly denied committing. The prosecution's case was built on the testimony of two witnesses who later recanted their statements, and there was no physical evidence linking Melendez to the crime scene. Despite these inconsistencies and the lack of concrete evidence, Melendez was sentenced to death. For years, Melendez maintained his innocence, but it wasn't until September 2000 that a breakthrough occurred. A transcript of a taped confession by the real killer was discovered, leading to the revelation that the true perpetrator had confessed to 16 individuals, either directly or indirectly, that Melendez was not involved in the murder. This new evidence prompted the state of Florida to review the case, and in 2002, Melendez was released from prison after spending more than 17 years on death row. The exoneration of Juan Melendez underscored the critical need for rigorous standards in the criminal justice system, particularly concerning capital punishment. It highlighted the potential for miscarriages of justice and the irreversible nature of the death penalty. The case prompted legal scholars, policymakers, and the public to re-evaluate the procedures and safeguards in place to prevent wrongful convictions. In the aftermath of Melendez's release, there was a renewed focus on the importance of DNA testing and other forensic methods in criminal investigations. The case served as a catalyst for discussions about the reliability of eyewitness testimony, the role of prosecutorial discretion, and the ethical considerations surrounding the death penalty. The story of Juan Melendez is a poignant reminder of the human cost of wrongful convictions and the imperative to uphold the principles of justice and fairness. It serves as a call to action for reforms aimed at preventing such injustices in the future and ensuring that the criminal justice system serves all individuals with integrity and respect. The revelation of Juan Melendez's wrongful conviction was not merely a personal victory for him. It was a turning point that resonated across the broader legal landscape. His case raised important questions about how the justice system processes evidence, the reliability of witness testimony, and the lengths to which the state can go to secure a conviction. With Melendez's exoneration, the focus shifted to the systemic flaws that allowed him to be sentenced to death despite a lack of credible evidence. For years, Melendez had been living in a small, isolated cell on death row. The psychological toll on him was enormous. It wasn't just the grueling prison life that wore him down, but the constant mental burden of knowing he was innocent. He had been convicted of a crime he had not committed, and yet, the weight of that false conviction had threatened to crush his spirit. But despite the oppressive conditions, he never wavered in his fight for justice. His resilience, even in the face of overwhelming odds, became a symbol of the resilience that countless other wrongfully convicted individuals would later draw upon. As Melendez spent year after year in prison, the legal battles continued outside the prison walls. His defense team was tireless in searching for new evidence that could prove his innocence, but each year seemed to bring only more frustration. The legal system had already been so quick to condemn him, and it was a fight to get the system to listen again. In fact, it took an almost accidental discovery in September 2000 a transcript from a taped confession by the real killer, that finally forced the system to confront its mistake. This new evidence, long hidden in a stack of overlooked paperwork, was a critical turning point in the case. The confession was a simple yet devastating revelation. The man who had actually committed the murder had been bragging about his actions to others, even going so far as to reveal the details to people who were familiar with the crime scene. The confession was not obtained through coercion, nor was it the result of any plea bargain. It was a candid and chilling admission that now, more than a decade later, would set the stage for Melendez's exoneration. What followed was a rapid series of legal proceedings that ultimately led to the reversal of Melendez's conviction. In a remarkable twist, prosecutors who had once vigorously defended the death sentence began to re-examine the evidence in light of the new confession. It became clear that the case against Melendez had been built on shaky ground, with little to no physical evidence connecting him to the crime. The witnesses who had initially testified against him had recanted, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. The emotional toll on Melendez, however, was far from over. He was initially granted a retrial, but it wasn't until the confession came to light that his case was finally thrown out. He would later reflect on the psychological trauma of those years spent in a cell, knowing that the world had condemned him based on a crime he didn't commit. For Melendez, it was a harsh and isolating reality, made all the worse by the knowledge that there were others in similar situations. He wasn't alone in his struggle. Other men and women were also incarcerated for crimes they had not committed, and many would never have the chance to prove their innocence. As Melendez was released, the public reaction was a mixture of relief, outrage, and a renewed sense of urgency. How could this have happened? How could a man spend 17 years on death row for a crime he didn't commit? For some, the case of Juan Melendez became a symbol of the failures within the criminal justice system. For others, it became a rallying cry to reform the way the system operates. It was a reminder of the profound and irreversible consequences of wrongful convictions, particularly in capital punishment cases where an innocent person could lose their life. In Florida, as well as in the United States more broadly, the Melendez case spurred legal reforms. Legal experts and advocates for the wrongly convicted pushed for more rigorous standards in criminal investigations, such as greater reliance on DNA testing and improved witness identification procedures. This case became an influential example of the need to implement better safeguards against wrongful convictions, especially for those facing the death penalty. The lack of tangible evidence, the reliance on dubious witness testimony, and the failure to properly vet the confession all pointed to serious flaws in the process that had sent Melendez to death row. In the years following his exoneration, Juan Melendez would become an outspoken advocate for criminal justice reform. His story became a powerful testament to the importance of reforming the justice system. He traveled across the country, speaking about the emotional and psychological toll of being wrongfully imprisoned, particularly under the shadow of a death sentence. He spoke about the need for greater transparency and accountability in the justice system, especially for the most vulnerable defendants who might not have the resources to mount an adequate defense. Though Melendez's release was an emotional moment of triumph, it was also an indictment of the system that allowed such miscarriages of justice to occur. The case was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern of wrongful convictions that had plagued the United States for years. His exoneration, however, was a reminder of the power of truth and perseverance in the face of overwhelming adversity. For Melendez, it was the beginning of a new chapter, but for the justice system, it was a wake-up call that could not be ignored. As Juan Melendez walked out of the Florida State Prison on that fateful day, the world that greeted him was a world he no longer recognized. The outside world had moved on, leaving him behind in a stagnant, isolated life. He was free, but it was a freedom tinged with confusion, anger, and disbelief. Over 17 years of his life had been stolen. His entire adulthood had been spent locked in a small cell, in constant fear of his life ending unjustly. How could anyone truly understand what that felt like? The years that had passed, the friendships that had faded, the changes in technology and culture, all of it felt like an alien world. He was a man out of time, and the emotional and psychological scars from his wrongful conviction would take years, perhaps a lifetime, to heal. The first thing Melendez did when he was released was speak out, but not in the way one might expect. He didn't simply express his relief or joy at being free. Instead, he spoke about the system that had failed him and countless others. He became an advocate for the wrongly convicted, using his own harrowing experience to shine a light on the broader issue of justice in the United States. His voice, grounded in the weight of his experience, resonated with people across the country. He was no longer just a victim of a miscarriage of justice. He was a symbol of resilience and the need for reform. Throughout his years on death row, Melendez had often been surrounded by others who had been wrongfully convicted. Some of them shared his tenacity, continuing to fight for justice even as the walls of the prison closed in on them. Others had given up hope long ago, accepting their fate as something they could not escape. But Melendez never lost his belief that the truth would eventually come to light, even if it took decades. His faith in justice, though shaken, was never completely broken. And now that he was free, he saw it as his duty to speak out on their behalf. Those who were still trapped in the prison system, waiting for a day when their innocence would be recognized. His advocacy was not just about the death penalty. It was about reforming a system that too often failed to protect the innocent. At the heart of the movement was the demand for better safeguards to prevent wrongful convictions, from improvements in the way evidence was handled to the need for better trained defense attorneys, particularly for those who couldn't afford the best legal representation. He spoke about the dangers of relying on circumstantial evidence or coerced confessions. The truth, he argued, was often hidden beneath layers of error, bias, and rushed judgments, and it was up to the public, lawmakers, and the courts to ensure that such mistakes did not cost innocent lives. In the years that followed, Melendez's case would become a rallying point for criminal justice reform activists. His release, along with the accompanying discovery of the real killer's confession, sparked widespread attention. This wasn't just a local issue in Florida. It was a nationwide issue that reached into the deepest corners of the justice system. The Melendez case became a critical case study for law schools and criminal justice reform groups, a stark reminder that the system was not infallible, no matter how much faith the public had placed in it. One of the most striking aspects of Melendez's story was the role that forensic science played in his eventual exoneration. It was the taped confession of the real killer, something that had been ignored for years, that had ultimately led to Melendez's release. In this case, forensic evidence had been absent, but the confession served as an undeniable piece of evidence that made the case against him crumble. However, the absence of solid forensic evidence and the failure of the prosecution to follow up on inconsistencies in witness testimony revealed serious flaws in the system. Melendez's case highlighted the need for more rigorous forensic protocols and the careful handling of evidence. As DNA testing continued to evolve, it was clear that these advancements could help prevent other miscarriages of justice like his. However, Melendez's case also raised a critical issue: the psychological impact of wrongful imprisonment. Though Melendez was released physically, his mind and spirit bore the scars of nearly 2 decades spent in solitary confinement, in constant fear of death. The toll on his mental health was profound. It wasn't just the years spent locked away from society, but the daily grind of trying to convince everyone, his fellow inmates, the guards, the attorneys, that he was innocent. The very fact that it had taken so long for his case to come to light was a burden Melendez had carried for years. The trauma of his wrongful conviction didn't fade the moment he stepped out of prison. He faced the daunting task of re-entering society after nearly 2 decades. Everything had changed: the culture, technology, the people in his life. Some friends had drifted away, unable to understand his ordeal. Others had passed away during the years he was locked up. Even his family, who had never given up on him, had aged. Reconnecting with loved ones was a process that took time and patience. For someone who had been institutionalized for so long, adjusting to the fast-paced world outside prison walls was overwhelming. Yet, amid all of this, there was a quiet resolve in Melendez. The fire of injustice had burned away many of the raw emotions, leaving behind a man driven by a single goal: to make sure that no one else would ever have to experience what he had. He would use his experience, his voice, and his story to push for reforms in the criminal justice system that would prevent future wrongful convictions. His story wasn't just about him. It was about all the others who had been forgotten, silenced, and dismissed. It was about all the people whose innocence had been overlooked, and whose voices had been muted by the system that was supposed to protect them. As the years passed, Melendez would continue his advocacy work, speaking at events, giving interviews, and becoming a key figure in the movement for justice reform. His experience, painful as it had been, had not destroyed him. It had made him stronger and more determined to fight for the changes needed in the justice system. For Juan Melendez, the fight for justice was not over. It had only just begun. Story 9. As Juan Melendez walked out of the Florida State Prison on that fateful day, the world that greeted him was a world he no longer recognized. The outside world had moved on, leaving him behind in a stagnant, isolated life. He was free, but it was a freedom tinged with confusion, anger, and disbelief. Over 17 years of his life had been stolen. His entire adulthood had been spent locked in a small cell, in constant fear of his life ending unjustly. How could anyone truly understand what that felt like? The years that had passed, the friendships that had faded, the changes in technology and culture, all of it felt like an alien world. He was a man out of time, and the emotional and psychological scars from his wrongful conviction would take years, perhaps a lifetime, to heal. The first thing Melendez did when he was released was speak out, but not in the way one might expect. He didn't simply express his relief or joy at being free. Instead, he spoke about the system that had failed him and countless others. He became an advocate for the wrongly convicted, using his own harrowing experience to shine a light on the broader issue of justice in the United States. His voice, grounded in the weight of his experience, resonated with people across the country. He was no longer just a victim of a miscarriage of justice. He was a symbol of resilience and the need for reform. Throughout his years on death row, Melendez had often been surrounded by others who had been wrongfully convicted. Some of them shared his tenacity, continuing to fight for justice even as the walls of the prison closed in on them. Others had given up hope long ago, accepting their fate as something they could not escape. But Melendez never lost his belief that the truth would eventually come to light, even if it took decades. His faith in justice, though shaken, was never completely broken. And now that he was free, he saw it as his duty to speak out on their behalf. Those who were still trapped in the prison system, waiting for a day when their innocence would be recognized. His advocacy was not just about the death penalty. It was about reforming a system that too often failed to protect the innocent. At the heart of the movement was the demand for better safeguards to prevent wrongful convictions, from improvements in the way evidence was handled to the need for better trained defense attorneys, particularly for those who couldn't afford the best legal representation. He spoke about the dangers of relying on circumstantial evidence or coerced confessions. The truth, he argued, was often hidden beneath layers of error, bias, and rushed judgments, and it was up to the public, lawmakers, and the courts to ensure that such mistakes did not cost innocent lives. In the years that followed, Melendez's case would become a rallying point for criminal justice reform activists. His release, along with the accompanying discovery of the real killer's confession, sparked widespread attention. This wasn't just a local issue in Florida. It was a nationwide issue that reached into the deepest corners of the justice system. The Melendez case became a critical case study for law schools and criminal justice reform groups, a stark reminder that the system was not infallible, no matter how much faith the public had placed in it. One of the most striking aspects of Melendez's story was the role that forensic science played in his eventual exoneration. It was the taped confession of the real killer, something that had been ignored for years, that had ultimately led to Melendez's release. In this case, forensic evidence had been absent, but the confession served as an undeniable piece of evidence that made the case against him crumble. However, the absence of solid forensic evidence and the failure of the prosecution to follow up on inconsistencies in witness testimony revealed serious flaws in the system. Melendez's case highlighted the need for more rigorous forensic protocols and the careful handling of evidence. As DNA testing continued to evolve, it was clear that these advancements could help prevent other miscarriages of justice like his. However, Melendez's case also raised a critical issue: the psychological impact of wrongful imprisonment. Though Melendez was released physically, his mind and spirit bore the scars of nearly 2 decades spent in solitary confinement, in constant fear of death. The toll on his mental health was profound. It wasn't just the years spent locked away from society, but the daily grind of trying to convince everyone, his fellow inmates, the guards, the attorneys, that he was innocent. The very fact that it had taken so long for his case to come to light was a burden Melendez had carried for years. The trauma of his wrongful conviction didn't fade the moment he stepped out of prison. He faced the daunting task of re-entering society after nearly 2 decades. Everything had changed: the culture, technology, the people in his life. Some friends had drifted away, unable to understand his ordeal. Others had passed away during the years he was locked up. Even his family, who had never given up on him, had aged. Reconnecting with loved ones was a process that took time and patience. For someone who had been institutionalized for so long, adjusting to the fast-paced world outside prison walls was overwhelming. Yet, amid all of this, there was a quiet resolve in Melendez. The fire of injustice had burned away many of the raw emotions, leaving behind a man driven by a single goal: to make sure that no one else would ever have to experience what he had. He would use his experience, his voice, and his story to push for reforms in the criminal justice system that would prevent future wrongful convictions. His story wasn't just about him. It was about all the others who had been forgotten, silenced, and dismissed. It was about all the people whose innocence had been overlooked, and whose voices had been muted by the system that was supposed to protect them. As the years passed, Melendez would continue his advocacy work, speaking at events, giving interviews, and becoming a key figure in the movement for justice reform. His experience, painful as it had been, had not destroyed him. It had made him stronger and more determined to fight for the changes needed in the justice system. For Juan Melendez, the fight for justice was not over. It had only just begun. The Serrian Elli case continued to reverberate across India long after the initial trial and convictions. As the legal proceedings unfolded, the complexities of the case began to reveal the deep-seated issues within the country's judicial system, especially when it came to sexual violence. The victim's ordeal, the involvement of multiple perpetrators, and the failure of the authorities to properly handle the case from the outset raised difficult questions about how justice could be better served for victims of sexual assault. The police investigation had been sluggish and inept in the early stages. Many believed that the case had been mishandled intentionally in order to protect the powerful individuals involved. The initial response from law enforcement suggested a deep-rooted bias, whether through corruption or apathy, that allowed perpetrators to act with impunity. It wasn't until the victim was able to escape and make her ordeal known that the true extent of the crime was revealed. By that point, much of the evidence had been compromised, and many of the perpetrators had gone into hiding, making it difficult to build a strong case. The lack of swift action by the police and their failure to properly investigate the crime further underscored the challenges women and children face when seeking justice in a deeply patriarchal society. The victim was often seen as the one responsible for the crime, with her character and actions scrutinized at every turn. Questions were raised about her credibility, with some casting doubt on whether she was truly abducted or whether she had somehow invited the assault upon herself. This kind of victim blaming and the lack of understanding about the dynamics of sexual violence were prevalent in public discourse at the time. The victim's bravery in reporting the crime and pursuing justice, despite the numerous obstacles in her path, was nothing short of remarkable. Yet, even in the face of all the hardships she endured, the legal proceedings were far from straightforward. The case saw numerous delays, with accused individuals able to leverage their connections and power to influence the course of the trial. It was evident that the legal process in India was deeply flawed, and the wheels of justice moved slowly, if at all. Public outrage grew, and there was an increasing demand for accountability. However, this demand often clashed with the reality of how cases involving sexual violence were handled. In October 2000, as the final verdicts were being handed down for the convicted individuals, a sense of uneasy justice settled over the public. While some had been sentenced to life imprisonment or heavy fines, there was a sense that not all the perpetrators had been held accountable. Many believed that the sentences were too lenient, considering the brutal nature of the crime and the years the victim had been forced to endure captivity and abuse. Furthermore, questions arose about the role of influential figures, including the primary accused, Dharmarajan, who had evaded capture for so long. His eventual arrest, after years of evading the authorities, became another point of contention for the public. Why had it taken so long for the police to catch him, despite the clear evidence against him? Was his escape a result of corruption or incompetence? Public outrage was not confined to just the criminal justice system, but extended to the social and cultural attitudes that allowed such a crime to occur in the first place. The Serrian Elli case, like so many others, exposed the deep roots of misogyny and gender inequality in Indian society. Women, particularly those from marginalized communities, were often seen as expendable, and their rights were routinely trampled upon by those in positions of power. The case brought to the forefront the grim reality that sexual violence was not just a matter of individual criminals, but a societal issue that required a concerted and systemic response. Despite the grim and tragic nature of the case, It sparked important conversations about the legal and social changes needed to protect women and children from sexual violence. It became a rallying cry for women's rights activists, and calls for legislative reform became louder. In particular, there was growing pressure for a more robust legal framework to ensure that perpetrators of sexual violence were held accountable, and that the voices of victims were heard and respected. The case also highlighted the importance of providing victims with support, both during the legal process and after their ordeal. The victim in the Serrian Elli case had to navigate not just the complexities of the legal system, but also the emotional and psychological toll of being subjected to such a horrific crime. The stigma surrounding sexual assault victims and the lack of adequate support systems in place made it all the more difficult for her to seek justice and healing. She was not only fighting for justice in the courts, but also for her own dignity and the right to move forward with her life. One of the most significant outcomes of the Serrian Elli case was its influence on the legal landscape of India. The case became an important reference point in subsequent legal reforms aimed at addressing sexual violence. Activists and lawmakers pointed to the mishandling of the case as an example of the need for stronger laws and more effective police training. It was also a reminder that laws alone would not be enough to prevent sexual violence. Cultural change was essential to address the deeply ingrained social attitudes that perpetuated such crimes. Over the years, the case has continued to be an important part of India's conversation on sexual violence and justice. The Serrian Elli victims' courage in coming forward, in the face of overwhelming societal and institutional barriers, paved the way for greater visibility for other survivors. It was a pivotal moment in the broader struggle for women's rights and gender equality in India. Yet, even as the legal system made small strides toward addressing sexual violence more effectively, the case serves as a reminder that justice for victims is often a long, complicated, and deeply personal journey. The scars left by such crimes do not heal quickly, and for many victims, the fight for justice continues long after the trial ends. As the years have passed, the Serrian Elli case has remained a key case study in understanding the failings of the justice system and the ongoing need for reform. It is a reminder that justice must be swift, fair, and accessible to all, regardless of their gender or social status. While the case resulted in some convictions, it is clear that much more needs to be done to protect the rights of women and children, and to ensure that the legal system functions as it should, protecting the innocent and holding the guilty accountable. As the Serrian Elli case continued to evolve, its long-lasting effects began to be felt across multiple spheres of Indian society, particularly in the realms of law, policy, and social movements. The public's frustration with the perceived slow pace of justice grew louder, and the case became a rallying point for activists advocating for reforms to the criminal justice system. While some of the convicted were incarcerated, many questions remained about the adequacy of the punishments, the institutional barriers faced by victims, and the broader social environment that allowed such crimes to persist. One of the most significant ramifications of the case was the increased scrutiny placed on India's criminal justice procedures, particularly how sexual assault cases were handled. For years, systemic issues such as inadequate police investigations, lengthy trials, and victim blaming had undermined the pursuit of justice for women who experienced violence. The Serrian Elli case exemplified the profound flaws within the system that allowed perpetrators to manipulate the system and evade justice. The case revealed how law enforcement officials were often underprepared to handle cases involving sexual violence, and how societal prejudices influenced the investigation, trial, and ultimate sentencing. Many experts and women's rights organizations argued that the Serrian Elli case demonstrated the need for judicial reforms that would streamline the legal process, reduce the time spent in the investigation and trial phases, and increase the effectiveness of the law in securing justice for survivors. One of the most glaring deficiencies was the delay in arresting Dharmarajan, the primary accused, who managed to evade capture for years after the crime was committed. His eventual arrest in 2000 was a relief to the public, but it also highlighted the failures in the investigation. It became clear that in cases involving powerful or influential individuals, the police and legal system often struggled to take timely and decisive action. In response to the public outcry, lawmakers began to acknowledge the inadequacies of the legal framework surrounding sexual violence. The Serrian Elli case served as a key catalyst for change, with the public demanding stronger laws and greater protection for victims of sexual assault. The case played a pivotal role in the eventual passage of new legal provisions designed to improve the way the Indian legal system responded to sexual violence. In 2013, India passed the Criminal Law Amendment Act, also known as the Nirbhaya Act, which aimed to expand the definition of rape, provide stricter punishments for offenders, and establish faster trial processes for cases involving sexual assault. These reforms were a direct response to widespread public outrage over high-profile cases of sexual violence, including the infamous Nirbhaya gang rape case in 2012, and the lessons drawn from earlier cases like Serrian Elli. Yet, despite these legislative strides, the broader cultural shift needed to truly address the problem of sexual violence remained an ongoing challenge. As the Serrian Elli case showed, the process of seeking justice was often hindered by entrenched gender biases and societal expectations. Victim blaming was a prevalent attitude that often found its way into public discourse. The victim in this case, as in many others, had to face skepticism, judgment, and invasive questioning regarding her personal life, all of which served to undermine her credibility and further perpetuated the shame and stigma attached to survivors of sexual violence. Public attitudes toward sexual assault and the treatment of survivors have slowly evolved, but the Serrian Elli case revealed just how deeply ingrained certain societal prejudices were. In particular, the media and public often viewed survivors through a lens of suspicion rather than empathy, asking questions about their behavior and motivations rather than focusing on the actions of the perpetrators. This tendency to question the victim's character, rather than investigating the crime itself, was an unfortunate byproduct of a society where sexual violence was often trivialized or swept under the rug. Moreover, the legal system's handling of evidence and the protection of victims in sensitive cases also became a focal point of reform. The slow pace of trials and the frequent delays in justice for sexual assault survivors were not unique to the Serrian Elli case, but reflected broader systemic issues that had affected many others. It was not enough for the law to punish offenders. It also needed to create a space where survivors could feel heard and believed. Ensuring that victims were treated with dignity and respect, that their voices were not ignored, and that they received the support they needed through every step of the legal process was just as important as securing convictions. Another important lesson drawn from the Serrian Elli case was the need for greater education on consent, gender equality, and sexual violence prevention. Although some strides were made in the years following the case, India's education system still struggled to impart an understanding of these vital issues. Legal reforms were necessary, but they were not sufficient on their own. It was crucial for society to shift its cultural norms and expectations, particularly with regard to women's safety and autonomy. This shift needed to occur in schools, workplaces, and communities, everywhere that societal values were shaped and reinforced. Only when both legal and cultural changes occurred simultaneously could India begin to address the deeply rooted problem of sexual violence in a meaningful way. Despite the significant legal and social challenges, the victim of the Serrian Elli case, whose identity remained largely protected throughout the trial, continued to be a source of inspiration for many. Her strength and courage in the face of unimaginable trauma, as well as her commitment to ensuring justice was served, became a beacon for those who were struggling in similar situations. She, along with countless other survivors, played an important role in raising awareness about the needs of those affected by sexual violence, the long road to recovery, and the importance of advocacy and support systems. While the legal process surrounding the Serrian Elli case took years to unfold, it was ultimately a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of justice. Though the case highlighted the failures of the criminal justice system, it also demonstrated the power of perseverance. Activists, lawmakers, and citizens rallied together, using the case to push for reform, to demand accountability, and to create a future where survivors could finally receive the support they deserved. In the end, the Serrian Elli case left an indelible mark on Indian society, one that sparked crucial debates, initiated reforms, and ultimately created a foundation for future progress in the fight against sexual violence. But even more importantly, it stood as a testament to the strength of those who refused to be silenced, victims, survivors, and advocates, who continue to push for a better, safer, and more just world for everyone. Story 10. In October 2000, the United States Supreme Court heard a pivotal case that would have significant implications for the criminal justice system. The case, Apprendi v. New Jersey, centered on the constitutionality of a New Jersey statute that allowed judges to impose sentences beyond the standard range based on their own findings of fact, rather than relying solely on facts established by a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. This practice raised fundamental questions about the Sixth Amendment right to a jury trial and the due process protections afforded to defendants. The case arose when Charles Apprendi, a man with a history of firearms offenses, fired several shots into the home of an African-American family in New Jersey. He was charged under a state statute that enhanced penalties for crimes motivated by racial bias. The statute permitted the judge to determine, by a preponderance of the evidence, whether the crime was racially motivated, thereby increasing the potential sentence. Apprendi contested this, arguing that the enhancement violated his constitutional rights because the jury had not found the racial motivation beyond a reasonable doubt. The Supreme Court's decision in Apprendi v. New Jersey was landmark. In a 5-4 ruling, the court held that any fact that increases the penalty for a crime beyond the prescribed statutory maximum must be submitted to a jury and proven beyond a reasonable doubt. This decision reinforced the principle that the Sixth Amendment guarantees a defendant's right to have a jury determine all facts that could lead to a sentence exceeding the standard range. The ruling had far-reaching consequences, prompting a re-evaluation of sentencing practices across the nation and leading to the development of what became known as the Apprendi Rule. The implications of the Apprendi decision were profound. It challenged the constitutionality of sentencing enhancements that were previously determined by judges based on their own findings. This shift required a reassessment of numerous sentencing statutes and practices, as courts and legislatures worked to align their procedures with the new constitutional standard. The decision also sparked debates about the balance of power between judges and juries, and the role of judicial discretion in sentencing. In the years following Apprendi, the court addressed related issues in subsequent cases, further refining the application of the Sixth Amendment in sentencing. For instance, in Blakely v. Washington, 2004, the court clarified that any fact that increases a defendant's sentence beyond the standard range must be admitted by the defendant or proven to a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. This reinforced the Apprendi decision and extended its principles to sentencing guidelines that allowed judges to enhance sentences based on their own findings. The Apprendi decision also had a significant impact on federal sentencing guidelines. Prior to the ruling, federal judges had considerable discretion in sentencing, often relying on their own findings to enhance sentences. Post-Apprendi, this discretion was curtailed, leading to a more standardized approach to sentencing and a greater emphasis on jury findings. This shift aimed to ensure that sentences were based on facts established through the constitutional process, thereby enhancing the fairness and transparency of the criminal justice system. Beyond the legal realm, the Apprendi decision resonated with the public and legal scholars, sparking discussions about the rights of defendants and the role of the jury in the American legal system. It highlighted the importance of protecting constitutional rights and ensuring that the justice system operates within the bounds of the law. The case underscored the need for vigilance in safeguarding individual rights, particularly in the context of sentencing, where the stakes are high and the potential for abuse is significant. In summary, the Apprendi v. New Jersey case, heard in October 2000, was a landmark decision that reinforced the constitutional rights of defendants in the sentencing phase of criminal trials. By requiring that any fact increasing a defendant's sentence beyond the statutory maximum be proven to a jury beyond a reasonable doubt, the court upheld the fundamental principles of justice and due process. The decision has had lasting effects on sentencing practices, ensuring greater fairness and adherence to constitutional standards in the criminal justice system. The implications of Apprendi v. New Jersey resonated far beyond the immediate legal landscape. For many in the criminal justice system, the ruling was a wake-up call to reassess how sentencing enhancements were handled in practice. Before Apprendi, judges had significant leeway in imposing sentences, sometimes extending penalties based on their own determinations of certain factors, such as whether a crime was motivated by racial prejudice, or whether a defendant had a history of violent behavior. These determinations were made without the need for a jury to be involved, and the legal principle behind them was largely accepted without challenge. However, the Apprendi decision upended this practice, insisting that such enhancements could no longer be decided solely by a judge. Instead, they had to be brought before a jury, and the facts supporting these enhancements had to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. This shift was not without controversy. Many legal experts and judges expressed concerns that the decision would create delays and disruptions in the sentencing process, leading to a backlog in courts across the country. The prospect of involving juries in every sentencing decision, particularly in cases where enhancements were relatively minor, seemed daunting. Some feared it would add complexity to an already overcrowded judicial system. Moreover, critics of the ruling argued that it could undermine the authority of judges, whose experience and discretion had long been seen as critical in determining fair sentences for offenders. Supporters of the decision, however, viewed it as a necessary step toward ensuring fairness and transparency in the criminal justice system. They argued that Apprendi reaffirmed the foundational principle of the American legal system, that a person is entitled to a trial by jury, and that a jury, not a judge, should have the power to determine the facts that could lead to an increased sentence. This decision was hailed as a victory for the rights of the accused and a safeguard against potential abuses of judicial power. By requiring that sentencing enhancements be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, Apprendi reinforced the idea that the burden of proof lies with the prosecution, and that defendants should not face harsher penalties based on a judge's subjective interpretation of facts. The immediate aftermath of Apprendi saw a significant shift in how sentencing was approached in courts nationwide. Many states and the federal government had to revise their sentencing structures to comply with the new standards set forth by the ruling. This led to the reconsideration of laws that allowed judges to enhance sentences based on factors like prior convictions, race, or gang affiliation. For instance, sentencing laws that permitted judges to impose harsher penalties based on their own findings of a defendant's prior criminal history were re-evaluated to ensure they were consistent with the Apprendi framework. In the federal system, Apprendi had a particularly far-reaching impact. Prior to the ruling, federal sentencing guidelines allowed judges to determine factors that would increase a defendant's sentence, such as the presence of a weapon during the commission of a crime or the amount of drugs involved in a drug trafficking offense. The guidelines also allowed judges to consider a defendant's role in a criminal organization or whether the crime had been committed with particular sophistication. Under the Apprendi decision, these factors could no longer be taken into account unless they were first proven to a jury. As a result, the federal sentencing guidelines had to be revised to ensure compliance with the new legal standard, prompting changes in how federal cases were prosecuted and sentenced. At the same time, the Apprendi decision led to a re-examination of the discretion afforded to judges in imposing sentences. The ruling limited judicial discretion in a way that some saw as beneficial, but others feared it would undermine the individualized nature of sentencing. The concern was that, with the involvement of juries in every sentencing enhancement, sentences could become more rigid and less tailored to the specific circumstances of each case. The possibility of mandatory minimum sentences and the necessity of meeting certain criteria in order for a sentence to be increased led to concerns that the flexibility, once granted to judges, would be severely curtailed. Despite these concerns, many legal scholars and activists continued to defend the Apprendi decision as a necessary check on judicial power. They pointed out that the risk of potential abuses of power by judges had long been a topic of concern, particularly in cases where factors like race, gender, or social status could play an unwarranted role in sentencing. By requiring jury involvement in sentencing decisions, Apprendi sought to level the playing field and ensure that a defendant's fate was not decided by the biases or subjective judgments of a single individual. This, supporters argued, was essential to preserving the integrity of the legal system. The decision also had ripple effects in how the public viewed the criminal justice system. For those advocating for reform, Apprendi was seen as part of a broader movement to ensure that defendants' rights were protected and that the justice system was held accountable for its actions. The ruling became a critical piece of the conversation surrounding mass incarceration and sentencing reform, as it underscored the need for a more transparent and equitable process in determining sentences. Proponents of criminal justice reform hailed the ruling as an important step in creating a system that prioritized fairness and minimized the potential for wrongful convictions or excessive punishments. On the other hand, there were critics who felt that the Apprendi ruling could inadvertently complicate the process of imposing necessary sentences for particularly dangerous offenders. For example, in cases where the sentencing enhancement was related to the victim's vulnerability or the severity of the crime, critics argued that a jury's involvement might delay the delivery of justice. These critics believed that judges, with their experience and expertise, were in a better position to assess the nuances of a case and impose an appropriate sentence. Nevertheless, the Apprendi decision undeniably marked a turning point in the way sentencing enhancements were viewed in the American legal system. It forced lawmakers, judges, and lawyers to rethink the intersection of law, rights, and fairness. It reminded the criminal justice system of the importance of upholding the constitutional rights of individuals, even in cases where the evidence seemed overwhelming or the crime particularly heinous. Over time, the decision influenced other landmark rulings, including Blakely v. Washington, 2004, and Booker v. United States, 2005, which further refined the principles of sentencing and jury involvement. These cases built on the foundation laid by Apprendi, creating a more consistent and predictable legal framework for sentencing decisions. Together, they represented a shift toward greater protections for defendants and a more transparent, equitable legal system. Ultimately, the Apprendi case was a milestone in the ongoing effort to balance the rights of the accused with the need for justice. While it certainly posed challenges for the criminal justice system, it also spurred meaningful reforms that aimed to make sentencing more just, equitable, and in line with constitutional guarantees. The ruling has had lasting effects on the legal landscape, shaping the way courts approach sentencing, enhancing transparency, and ensuring that the voice of the jury plays a critical role in the process. As the legal community absorbed the full impact of Apprendi v. New Jersey, its ramifications continued to unfold across the landscape of sentencing law, as well as in broader discussions about criminal justice reform. The decision, though seemingly narrow at first glance, became a cornerstone of a much larger movement to address the inconsistencies and inequities within the American legal system. It brought to the forefront critical issues related to sentencing disparities, the rights of defendants, and the role of juries in ensuring fair outcomes in criminal cases. As courts struggled to reconcile Apprendi with existing laws, it prompted a series of legal battles, legislative adjustments, and societal debates. One of the most profound impacts of Apprendi was the challenge it posed to the existing state and federal sentencing guidelines. For decades, judges had been given the discretion to enhance sentences based on a variety of factors, including the defendant's criminal history, the severity of the offense, and sometimes even factors such as the defendant's potential for rehabilitation. However, Apprendi changed that dynamic by requiring that any facts which would increase the defendant's sentence beyond the statutory maximum be determined by a jury. This fundamentally altered the way courts approached sentencing, pushing for a more standardized, transparent process in which the jury, not the judge, would have the final say on the facts that could lead to a longer sentence. For the first time in decades, judges had to reconsider the way they had operated under previous sentencing structures. Legal experts and lawmakers grappled with how to ensure compliance with Apprendi while maintaining the effectiveness of sentencing guidelines. On one hand, the decision was hailed as a victory for the rights of the accused, ensuring that a defendant's fate was not determined by the subjective opinions of a judge. On the other hand, critics warned that this would slow down the criminal justice process and create more opportunities for delay, particularly in cases where the sentencing enhancement was relatively minor. The increased role of the jury also raised concerns about the potential for inconsistency in sentencing, as different juries might come to different conclusions based on the same evidence. Despite these challenges, many saw Apprendi as a necessary step toward more equitable sentencing practices. The ruling brought to light the potential for judges to impose sentences that were harsher than necessary based on factors that were not subject to the rigorous standards of proof required by the Constitution. One area of particular concern was the use of mandatory minimum sentences, which had been a cornerstone of sentencing law for decades. These sentences, often set by statute rather than by judges, had been criticized for disproportionately affecting marginalized communities and for leading to excessively harsh sentences in nonviolent offenses, such as drug-related crimes. Apprendi provided an opportunity to revisit these practices and ensure that they adhered to constitutional standards. In the years following Apprendi, the decision sparked a wave of reform efforts aimed at addressing some of the long-standing issues within the criminal justice system. One of the most important developments was the increasing recognition of the need for sentencing reforms that would take into account the full context of a defendant's life and the circumstances surrounding the crime. For instance, the use of three strikes laws, which mandated life sentences for individuals convicted of 3 serious crimes, came under scrutiny. Critics argued that these laws failed to take into account factors such as the defendant's age, mental health, or the nature of the offense. By requiring that sentencing enhancements be determined by a jury, Apprendi added an additional layer of scrutiny to these laws, forcing lawmakers to reconsider their validity. The decision also contributed to the rise of the broader movement for criminal justice reform, which gained momentum throughout the 2000s and 2010s. Advocates for reform pointed to the disparities in sentencing, particularly in drug-related offenses, and used Apprendi as a starting point for discussing how the system could be made more just and equitable. The debate surrounding mandatory minimums, racial disparities, and the role of judges versus juries in determining sentences became central to these discussions. Apprendi was often cited as a critical step in the movement toward reducing mass incarceration and ensuring that sentences were not influenced by factors such as race or socioeconomic status. As the years passed, Apprendi continued to influence subsequent Supreme Court decisions, each one building on the foundations laid by the 2000 ruling. In Blakely v. Washington, 2004, the court further expanded on the Apprendi decision, holding that the facts that trigger sentencing enhancements must not only be proven to a jury, but must also be admitted by the defendant or found beyond a reasonable doubt. This case reinforced the idea that the Sixth Amendment protects an individual's right to have a jury, not a judge, determine the facts that could affect the length of their sentence. Then, in United States v. Booker, 2005, the court addressed the federal sentencing guidelines, ruling that judges could no longer impose sentences based on enhancements that had not been proven to a jury. This decision effectively made the guidelines advisory rather than mandatory, further limiting judicial discretion in sentencing. Despite these legal victories, the impact of Apprendi was not always clear-cut. Some argued that while the decision might have made the sentencing process more transparent, it also created new challenges for courts, especially in cases involving complex factual determinations. Additionally, the requirement for jury involvement in sentencing decisions led to concerns about the efficiency of the criminal justice system, with critics fearing that it would slow down the trial process and lead to more inconsistencies in sentencing. Furthermore, while Apprendi sought to ensure fairness in sentencing, it did not address broader issues such as the overuse of pretrial detention, the failure to consider rehabilitative factors, or the lack of resources for public defenders. Nonetheless, the Apprendi decision remains a key moment in the evolution of criminal sentencing law, one that highlighted the need to balance the rights of the defendant with the need for justice. Its lasting impact has been felt across multiple facets of the criminal justice system, from legislative reforms to the ways in which courts approach sentencing decisions. The principles established in Apprendi have continued to shape the broader dialogue around criminal justice reform, particularly in relation to sentencing disparities, mandatory minimum sentences, and the role of juries in the justice system. In the end, Apprendi v. New Jersey did more than just alter the legal landscape of sentencing. It sparked a movement toward greater fairness, transparency, and constitutional protections in criminal cases. While the decision itself may have seemed focused on a specific aspect of sentencing law, its ripple effects have been felt across the entire criminal justice system, setting the stage for future reforms and a continued push for a more just and equitable society. As courts and lawmakers continue to navigate the complexities of criminal justice, Apprendi stands as a reminder of the importance of protecting the constitutional rights of individuals and ensuring that the legal system operates fairly for all.